In the summer of 1942, on an island so small and so green that most men who stepped onto its beaches had to ask the name twice, a young Japanese engineering officer named Hiroshi Tanaka stood in the shade of a transport ship's railing and tried to picture the home he had left behind. He had kissed his wife goodbye in Osaka only 6 weeks earlier, promising her that this posting would be the one that finally brought him closer to the end of the war and back into her arms. Now, as the humid air pressed against his face like a living thing, he wondered whether he had been lying to both of them. The island was called Guadalcanal by the few outsiders who knew it at all. To the Japanese High Command it was simply another stepping stone, one more piece of ground that, if turned into an airfield, could let their bombers reach the sea lanes that fed Australia. Cut those lanes and the enemy's southern anchor would begin to starve. The war might shorten by months, perhaps years. That was the bet. And Hiroshi, like every other man on the crowded deck, had been chosen to make that bet real with his own hands and his own health. When the landing craft finally ground onto the dark sand at Lunga Point, the first thing that struck him was not the beauty of the place but its indifference. The jungle rose in a solid wall only a few dozen paces from the water, thick with vines that seemed to move even when there was no wind. Birds called with voices that sounded almost human, and the air itself carried the sweet rot smell of things growing and dying at the same time. Hiroshi's men, some of them barely out of their teens, stepped off the ramp and immediately began to slap at their arms and necks. Within an hour the first cases of fever would appear. Within a day the mosquitoes would feel like a second skin. He tried to keep his voice steady when he gathered them. "We clear the ground here," he said, pointing to the flat stretch near the point. "We build a runway long enough for heavy bombers. When it is finished, our planes will be able to reach out and stop the enemy's supplies before they ever reach their soldiers in the south. That is why we are here. That is how we bring our families home sooner." Some of the younger men nodded with the quick pride of soldiers who still believed their leaders saw the whole board. Others simply looked at the jumble and said nothing. Hiroshi noticed one private, a quiet farmer's son named Sato, already kneeling to touch the soil as if testing whether it would accept them. The work began before the sun was fully up the next morning. There were no heavy machines, only axes, machetes, and the strength of backs that had never known this kind of heat. Trees that had stood for 100 years came down with groans that echoed across the clearing. Vines were hacked away in armfuls that left men's hands bleeding. By midday the sun turned the open ground into an oven. Sweat ran into eyes and mouths. Canteens emptied faster than they could be refilled from the muddy streams. Hiroshi moved among the work parties constantly, offering water from his own canteen to any man who looked ready to drop, quietly taking the heaviest end of a log when he saw 2 exhausted soldiers struggling. He told himself these small things were necessary for discipline. In truth, they were the only way he could keep his own fear from showing. At night the jungle came alive in a different way. The insects formed a single, endless note that made sleep almost impossible. Men lay on rough mats listening to it and thinking of the villages they had left, the sound of their mothers cooking, the laughter of children playing in irrigation ditches, the cool evenings when the only thing that bit was the occasional mosquito from the rice fields. Sato, the quiet private, began to keep a small notebook. He wrote short letters he knew he could never send, describing the strange trees and the way the rain came down so hard it felt like the sky itself was angry. One evening he showed Hiroshi a page. "I told my little sister the island is beautiful," he said softly. "I did not tell her about the fever or the way the men cry out in their sleep." Hiroshi had no answer for that. He only nodded and handed the notebook back, then walked the perimeter once more so no one would see the sudden tightness in his own throat. The educational truth of the place revealed itself slowly, through the bodies of the men rather than through any map. Every day that the runway grew longer, the men understood a little more why their commanders had chosen this spot. From here a bomber could fly far enough to find the slow convoys carrying food, fuel, and reinforcements to Australia. Stop enough of those ships and the enemy's southern forces would weaken without ever having to be attacked directly. It was elegant on paper. On the ground it meant that every extra meter of cleared earth cost another man his strength, another night of fever dreams, another letter that would never reach home. Hiroshi began to notice that the same soldiers who had once sung marching songs in the evenings now spoke less. When they did speak, it was often about the same thing: how long before the first plane would land, how soon they could say the job was finished and perhaps be sent somewhere else, anywhere else. There were moments of unexpected grace. One afternoon, a sudden downpour turned the half-finished strip into a river of mud. A section of drainage ditch collapsed, threatening to wash away days of work. Without being ordered, Sato and two others stripped to their waists and worked waist-deep in the rushing water, passing sandbags hand to hand until the flow was diverted. When they finally climbed out, shivering and covered in leeches, Hiroshi made sure each of them received an extra portion of whatever passed for rice that night. He did not make a speech. He simply sat with them while they ate and listened as Sato described, for the first time, the small farm he hoped to return to one day. In that moment the island felt almost bearable. But the cost kept mounting. Malaria moved through the camp like a slow fire. Men who had arrived strong began to shake with chills so violent they could not hold a tool. The makeshift sick bay filled with bodies that grew thinner every day. Hiroshi wrote his own letters home in the small hours, always careful to sound confident. "The work goes well," he told his wife. "The men are in good spirits. I think of you every evening when the stars come out." He never mentioned the way his own hands had begun to tremble after too many nights without real sleep, or the way he sometimes woke convinced he could smell the cooking fires of Osaka only to open his eyes to the same dark wall of jungle. By the time the runway was finally declared ready for its first aircraft, nearly a third of the original workforce was too weak to stand for the ceremony. Hiroshi stood at the edge of the strip with what remained of his men and watched a single bomber touch down in a cloud of dust and cheers that sounded thinner than they should have. The plane taxied to a stop. The pilot climbed out, saluted, and said something about how the strip was longer than he had expected. Hiroshi managed a smile and a few polite words, but his eyes kept drifting to the faces of his soldiers, the ones still standing, the ones already gone to the sick bay, the ones who would never leave this island at all. He thought of the bet the High Command had made. He thought of the families waiting back home for letters that would grow fewer and fewer. And for the first time he allowed himself to wonder whether any runway, no matter how long, could ever be worth what it had already taken from them. What none of them could know, standing there in the fading light while the bomber's engines ticked as they cooled, was that the island they had claimed with such effort was no longer a secret. Far away, in dimly lit rooms filled with the quiet scratch of pencils and the low murmur of radio traffic, other men were already studying reports and photographs, already feeling the same knot of responsibility tightening in their own chests. They were beginning to understand that this remote airfield, built by exhausted hands in a place most maps still ignored, could not be allowed to live. These men had given their strength, their health, and in many cases pieces of their futures to a patch of jungle most of the world had never heard of. Their courage, their endurance, and their quiet belief that what they were doing mattered, it is the same spirit you will find throughout the Pacific War. If these stories move you the way they move me, I think you will find real value in the powerful film Midway, streaming now on Prime Video. It captures the same high-stakes courage and impossible decisions that defined this entire theater. Or if you prefer something you can hold in your hands, there are excellent books and carefully chosen Pacific War memorabilia that let you connect more deeply with the sacrifices made in these waters. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. And yet the runway was only the beginning. The men who had built it would soon discover that holding it would demand even more than clearing the land had ever asked. The island that had seemed so insignificant on any map was about to become the place where ordinary people on both sides would be forced to decide how much they were willing to give and how much they were willing to lose, for a victory that still felt impossibly far away. In a quiet room thousands of miles from any front line, General Alexander Vandegrift sat with a single sheet of paper in his hands and felt the full weight of what it asked him to do. The orders were clear enough on the surface: take a division of Marines, most of them young and untested, and throw them against a Japanese-held island in the Solomons before the enemy could finish an airfield that would threaten the entire southern supply route to Australia. What the paper did not say was how many of those young men might never come home, or how thin the margin for error truly was. Vandegrift had been a Marine for more than 30 years. He knew what it felt like to give orders that cost lives. But this was different. These were not the seasoned troops he had commanded in earlier campaigns. These were boys who had joined after Pearl Harbor, many straight from small towns and farms, still learning how to move through jungle that could hide an enemy 10 feet away. He had seen the training reports. He had walked among them in New Zealand, watching them drill in the rain, listening to their nervous laughter when they tried to imagine what waited ahead. Some of them still wrote home about the adventure they thought they were on. Vandegrift knew better. He kept a photograph of his own family in the breast pocket of his uniform. On nights when sleep would not come, he would take it out and steady their faces under the dim light of a single bulb. His wife's steady gaze, the children who still believed their father could protect them from anything. He never wrote to them about the doubts that pressed on him now. Instead, he wrote the kind of letters a commander was supposed to write, short, reassuring, focused on duty. But in the quiet hours he allowed himself to wonder whether he was about to ask too much of boys who had not yet learned how much war could take. The decision to launch Operation Watchtower had not come easily. In Washington, the highest commanders had argued late into the night. Some believed it was reckless to strike so far forward with so little preparation. Others insisted that if they waited, the Japanese would finish their airfield and use it to cut the lifeline to Australia. Without Australia as a base, the entire Allied position in the South Pacific could collapse. Ships carrying food, fuel, and reinforcements would be hunted from the air before they ever reached their destinations. Families waiting for those ships would receive different telegrams. The war would grow longer and bloodier for everyone. Vandegrift understood the logic. He had sat through the briefings. He had studied the sparse intelligence on the island, the half-finished runway, the Japanese garrison that was small but growing, the jungle that seemed to swallow every attempt at reconnaissance. What troubled him was not the map. It was the faces of the men he would lead. Most of the 1st Marine Division had never been in combat. They had trained hard, but training could not replicate the moment when the first bullets cracked past your head or when the man next to you fell without a sound. Vandegrift had seen that moment before. He knew it changed people in ways no lecture could prepare them for. One evening, before the transport sailed, he walked the lines where his Marines were camped. He stopped to speak with a young corporal named Tommy Ellison from a small town in Ohio. Tommy was barely 20, newly married, and carried a photograph of his wife in the same way Vandegrift carried his own family picture. They talked for a few minutes about nothing important: the food, the weather, the strange birds that called at night. Then Tommy asked, quietly, whether the general thought they would be all right. Vandegrift did not lie to him. He said only that they would do their best and look out for one another. After he moved on, he heard Tommy writing a letter by flashlight, telling his wife that everything was fine and that he would be home before she knew it. Vandegrift wondered how many such letters were being written that night across the whole division. The gamble felt even larger when he considered what little they truly knew. Intelligence reports suggested the Japanese were building the airfield quickly, but no one could say exactly how many troops were already on the island or how soon the first bombers might be ready to fly. The Navy could promise only limited support. There were not enough carriers, not enough destroyers, not enough of anything to guarantee that the Marines would be protected once they went ashore. If the Japanese fleet appeared in strength, the transports might have to withdraw and leave the landing force stranded. Van de Grift had read the estimates. He understood that success depended on speed, surprise, and a kind of luck that no commander liked to admit he needed. Yet the alternative was worse. Every day the Japanese worked on that runway brought them closer to being able to strike at will. Every ship sunk on the way to Australia meant more families receiving the news that their sons or husbands would not be coming home. Van de Grift had seen enough of war to know that hesitation could cost more lives in the long run than action. Still, the knowledge did not make the orders easier to give. On the night before the convoy left New Zealand, he gathered his senior officers. The room was crowded and hot. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, maps spread across tables that had once held mess kits. Van de Grift spoke plainly. He told them the division was not ready in the way any of them would have preferred. He told them the intelligence was thin and the risks were real. Then he told them why they were going anyway. The Japanese had to be stopped before their airfield became operational. If it was not stopped now, the cost in ships and lives would only grow. He looked around the room and saw the same mixture of resolve and quiet fear he felt in himself. No one asked questions they already knew the answers to. When the meeting ended, the officers returned to their units and passed the word in their own way, some with speeches, others with nothing more than a handshake and a look that said everything. The young Marines themselves carried their own private burdens. Many had never been farther from home than the nearest big city. Now they were sailing toward an island most of them could not pronounce. On the transport ships the days blurred together in a haze of drills, inspections, and long hours spent staring at the horizon. Some wrote letters every day. Others kept their thoughts to themselves, staring at the sea and wondering whether they would ever see their families again. Small kindnesses became important. A sergeant might share his last pack of cigarettes with a homesick private. A chaplain moved quietly among the bunks, listening more than he spoke. One evening a group of Marines gathered on deck to sing songs from home. Their voices carried across the water, thin against the sound of the engines, but for a little while the fear felt smaller. Van de Grift moved among them when he could. He made a point of learning names, of asking about hometowns and sweethearts. He knew these gestures would not change what was coming, but he also knew that men fought harder for leaders who saw them as individuals rather than numbers on a roster. One afternoon he found a young lieutenant sitting alone, staring at a letter he could not bring himself to finish. The lieutenant's hands were shaking. Van de Grift sat with him for a few minutes without speaking. When he finally rose to leave, he simply placed a hand on the young man's shoulder and said, "We will get through this together." It was not much. It was all he had to give. The educational reality of the moment settled on everyone differently. For the commanders it was a question of logistics and timing, how to get enough men and supplies ashore before the Japanese could react. For the Marines it was more personal. They were being asked to step into the unknown with weapons they had only recently learned to use, against an enemy whose fighting spirit had already become legend. They had heard stories from earlier battles. They knew the Japanese did not surrender easily. What they did not yet know was how the jungle itself would fight them, the heat that drained strength by midday, the insects that carried disease, the rain that turned every trail into mud. Those lessons would come later. For now, the only certainty was that they were going. As the convoy steamed northward, Van de Grift spent long hours on the bridge or in his cabin, reviewing plans that felt thinner with every passing day. He thought about the airfield the Japanese were building and what it would mean if they finished it. He thought about the families waiting back home for news that had not yet been written. And he thought about the young men sleeping in the holds below, some of them still boys in everything but uniform. The gamble was not just military. It was human. Every order he gave would ripple outward into lives he would never meet, mothers who would wait for letters that stopped coming, children who would grow up without fathers, wives who would learn to live with a different kind of silence. The night before they reached their destination, Van de Grift walked the deck alone. The sea was calm, the stars unusually bright. He stopped at the rail and looked out across the dark water toward the horizon where the island waited. He did not pray in the formal sense, but he allowed himself a moment of quiet hope that the gamble would be worth what it was about to cost. Then he turned and went below to check on his men one last time before the morning that would change everything. The men who sailed with him carried the same mixture of fear and determination into the unknown. What awaited them on that island was far more brutal and personal than any map or briefing could ever show. If you want to see the raw, unfiltered reality of what these young Marines were heading into, the kind of photographs and footage that capture the true cost of jungle warfare and naval combat in ways that are simply too harsh for most platforms, then I want to share something special with you. There is a digital collection available that gathers rare, uncensored images and historical footage from the Guadalcanal campaign, material that reveals the unvarnished human story behind the headlines. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. What none of them could know as they prepared to go ashore was that the gamble they were making would not end with the first day's fighting. The island that had seemed like a distant objective on a map was about to become a place where every assumption about how this war would be fought would be tested in the most personal way possible. And the young men who stepped onto its beaches would soon discover that courage, in the end, was measured not by the orders they received but by what they chose to do when those orders ran out. Private Joe Harlan stood in the pitching landing craft with salt spray stinging his face and tried to remember the last time he had felt truly safe. Back home in Indiana, the cornfields had stretched flat and familiar under a sky that never seemed to threaten anything worse than rain. Now, in the gray light before dawn, the dark shape of Guadalcanal rose ahead of him like a wall that had no end. The boat rose and fell on the swells. Around him other young Marines gripped their rifles the same way he did, too tightly, as if the wood could steady the hammering in their chests. A sergeant near the bow turned and looked back at them. His voice carried just far enough over the engine. "This is it, boys. Keep your heads down, move fast when we hit the sand, and look out for the man next to you. We do this together." Joe nodded without speaking. He had written a letter to his mother the night before, telling her he was fine and that the training had been hard but good. He had not told her that the training had never once prepared him for the way his stomach felt right now, or for the way every wave seemed to be carrying him farther from everything he knew. The landing craft slammed into the sand with a grinding jolt that threw several men forward. The ramp dropped and suddenly the world was noise and motion. Joe waded into water that reached his thighs, the weight of his pack and rifle pulling him down with every step. The beach was narrow and dark. Palm trees leaned over it like spectators. For a few long seconds there was no firing, only the sound of boots splashing and men breathing hard. Then a single shot cracked from somewhere in the trees. It was answered by a dozen rifles firing at shadows that might have been nothing at all. Joe dropped to one knee in the surf, heart slamming so hard he could feel it in his throat. A buddy named Ray grabbed his arm and hauled him forward. "Keep moving, Joe. Don't stop in the open." They reached the sand and kept going, half running, half stumbling toward the tree line. The resistance was scattered and light, a few Japanese laborers and a small security detail who had not expected anyone to arrive at first light. Most of them melted back into the jumble rather than stand and fight. Joe saw one man in a white shirt and shorts running barefoot across an open patch of ground. He did not fire. The man disappeared into the green and Joe felt a strange, guilty relief that he had not had to pull the trigger on someone who looked more like a worker than a soldier. The column pushed inland along a rough track that led toward the airfield the Japanese had been building. Joe's boots sank into soft earth that smelled of rotten flowers at the same time. The jungle pressed close on both sides, alive with sounds he could not name. Somewhere ahead an officer was shouting for them to keep the pace. Joe glanced at Ray, who was breathing hard but moving steadily. Ray had been in the Corps longer. He had the calm of a man who had already decided that fear was something you carried rather than something you let decide for you. When Joe started to slow, Ray simply said, "Stay with me. We're almost there." They reached the edge of the airfield clearing and stopped. What they saw was not a finished base but a half-built promise. The runway was a long strip of packed coral and dirt, wider in some places than others, with piles of lumber and drums of fuel still sitting where the workers had left them. A few Japanese trucks stood abandoned. One had its hood open as if someone had been trying to fix it when the first shells began to fall offshore. Joe walked a few steps onto the coral and felt the strange solidity of it under his boots. This was what they had come for. This was the reason they had crossed an ocean and stepped into a place none of them had ever seen on a map until a few weeks ago. A lieutenant moved among them, checking positions, telling men to spread out and watch the tree line. Joe found himself assigned to a small group that was to secure the western end of the strip. They dug shallow fighting holes with their entrenching tools, the metal ringing against coral. The work was hard and the sun was already climbing, turning the clearing into an oven. Sweat ran down Joe's back and into his eyes. He kept looking toward the jungle and wondering how many Japanese were still out there, watching. Ray sat down beside him during a short break and passed over a canteen. "Drink slow," he said. "We don't know when we'll get more." Joe took a careful sip and handed it back. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Ray said, almost to himself, "My kid brother used to race me to the barn every morning. I wonder what he'd think if he could see this." Joe thought of his own mother standing at the kitchen window, watching the road for a mail truck that might bring another letter. He did not say it out loud. Instead, he nodded and went back to deepening his hole. As the morning wore on, more of the airfield came under their control. They found stacks of construction supplies, a few light machine guns that had been left behind, and personal items scattered where the Japanese workers had fled. Joe picked up a small photograph that had fallen near one of the trucks, a young woman in a simple dress standing in front of a wooden house. He looked at it for a long moment, then placed it carefully on the seat of the truck rather than keep it. The face in the picture was someone's daughter or sister or wife. Taking it would have felt like stealing something that did not belong to him. By midday, the main part of the airfield was in American hands. A small flag went up on a makeshift pole near one end of the strip. There were no cheers, only a quiet sense that something important had been taken. Joe stood with his rifle across his chest and looked out across the coral toward the sea. The transports were still visible in the distance, but they seemed very far away. The protective ring of warships that had brought them here was already beginning to thin as some ships turned to other tasks. For the first time since the ramp had dropped, Joe felt the full weight of how alone they were. The island was theirs for the moment, but it was also vast and unknown, and the Japanese would not simply let them keep it. That afternoon a runner came through with orders to dig in deeper and prepare for night. Joe and Ray worked side by side, widening their hole and piling coral in front of it. Other Marines moved through the positions, sharing what little extra water and rations they had. One man passed Joe a piece of chocolate he had been saving for later, he said, and moved on before Joe could thank him. Small acts like that had started to mean more than any speech. They reminded each other that they were still a unit, still connected even as the jungle pressed closer and the sun began to drop. When darkness finally came, it arrived quickly. The jungle turned into a wall of sound, insects, night birds, the occasional distant call that might have been human or might not. Joe sat with his back against the coral wall of the hole and listened. Ray was close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Neither of them slept much. Joe thought about the letter he had written the night before and wondered whether it had already been mailed or whether it was still sitting in a bag somewhere on one of the ships. He thought about the photograph he had left on the truck seat and hoped whoever it belonged to was somewhere safe. Mostly he thought about how the day had started with the words "This is it, boys," and how those words now felt both true and incomplete. The landing had happened. The airfield was theirs. But the real test, he was beginning to understand, was only starting. The men who had waded ashore that morning had crossed more than water. They had stepped into a place where every assumption about how this war would be fought was about to be tested by heat, disease, isolation, and an enemy who would not give ground easily. What they carried with them now was not just rifles and packs, but the quiet knowledge that they were far from home and that the island, for all its sudden silence, was already deciding who would survive it. These young men had come ashore carrying the hopes of families they might never see again and the simple determination to look out for the man next to them. Keeping their stories alive, the fear they felt in the boats, the small kindnesses they showed one another, and the courage it took to keep moving when every instinct said to freeze, requires real time and care. If the courage of these ordinary Marines has stayed with you the way it stays with me, then I would be grateful if you would consider leaving a small tip, as little as $1, on Ko-Fi. Every bit helps support the research and the long hours it takes to bring these forgotten human stories to light for the generations who will come after us. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. By the time the first night on Guadalcanal settled over the captured airfield, the Marines who had landed that morning were already learning that holding what they had taken would demand even more than the landing itself. The island that had seemed almost empty at first light was beginning to feel like a place that was only waiting for the right moment to push back. And the young men in the shallow holes along the coral strip were beginning to understand that the words "this is it, boys" had not been an ending. They had been the first line of a story that was still being written with every hour they remained on that beach. In the black hours before dawn, on a ship gliding through the narrow waters north of Guadalcanal, a young sailor named William pressed his face against the cool metal of a gun mount and tried to convince himself that the shapes he kept seeing in the darkness were only tricks of tired eyes. He had been on watch for hours. The sea was calm, almost glassy, and the only sounds were the low thrum of the engines and the occasional murmur of voices from the bridge. Somewhere out there, other Allied ships were doing the same thing, circling slowly, watching for trouble, protecting the Marines who had landed the day before. William kept telling himself that nothing would happen tonight. The Japanese were supposed to be far away. The landing had gone almost too easily. Maybe the worst was already behind them. He had written a short letter to his sister that afternoon, telling her the food was better than he had expected and that the Pacific looked peaceful from the deck. He had not mentioned the way his hand still shook a little when he thought about the landing craft he had watched heading toward the beach, or the way the distant jungle had looked so still and waiting. Now, in the dark, he kept one hand on the railing and the other near his life jacket, though he told himself he would not need it. The ship felt solid beneath his feet. The sea felt empty. And yet something in the air made the hair on his arms stand up. A few hundred yards away, on another cruiser, a chief petty officer named Harlan moved quietly among his men, checking equipment that did not need checking and offering quiet words that did not need saying. Harlan had been in the Navy long enough to know that quiet nights were often the ones that turned bad fastest. He had seen it before in other oceans. He stopped beside a young seaman who was staring too hard at the water and laid a hand on his shoulder. "Breathe easy, son. We're all watching the same sea." The young man nodded without looking away from the darkness. Harlan stayed with him for a minute longer than he needed to, then moved on. Small gestures like that had kept men steady before. He hoped they would be enough tonight. Farther south, on the beach the Marines had taken the day before, the men who had waded ashore were trying to sleep in shallow holes along the edge of the captured airfield. Some of them could still hear the distant rumble of ship engines out in the Sound. Private Joe Harlan, no relation to the chief on the cruiser, though the shared name would have made him smile if he had known, lay on his back and watched the stars through a gap in the palm fronds. He had spent the day helping to strengthen positions and exploring the half-finished Japanese runway. Now the darkness felt heavier than it had on the ship that brought him here. He thought about the letter he had written before the landing and wondered if it had already started its long journey home. He thought about Ray, who was sleeping a few feet away, and about how Ray had said almost nothing since they secured the strip. Joe closed his eyes and tried to picture his mother's kitchen. He was still trying when the first distant flash lit the horizon. Out on the water, the night exploded without warning. Japanese cruisers had slipped through the darkness like ghosts, their lookouts already locked onto the Allied silhouettes. The first torpedoes ran true and silent. On William's ship, the deck jumped beneath his feet as if something massive had struck from below. Alarms screamed. Men who had been dozing in their bunks came tumbling up ladders half-dressed, grabbing helmets and life jackets as they ran. William stayed at his station because there was nowhere else to go. The first shells arrived seconds later, bright, terrible flowers of light that turned night into day for a heartbeat and then left everything darker than before. He saw the other ships firing back, their guns swinging wildly as captains tried to make sense of where the enemy was. The sea between them filled with splashes and the sudden roar of exploding torpedoes. One ship took a hit that sent a column of flame shooting straight up into the sky. William watched it and felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had trained for this. He had drilled for night actions and damage control. None of it had prepared him for the way the burning ship looked like a living thing in pain, or for the way the screams carried across the water when men began jumping from the decks. On the bridge, officers shouted orders that were already too late. The captain tried to turn the ship to bring more guns to bear, but the Japanese cruisers were moving with a speed and coordination that felt impossible in the dark. Another salvo struck. The deck tilted. William felt hot metal fragments sing past his face. He stayed at his post because leaving it would have meant abandoning the men who were still fighting their guns. When a shell exploded nearby and knocked him to his knees, he got up again because there was nothing else to do. Around him, men were doing the same thing, loading, aiming, firing into a darkness that refused to give up its secrets. Chief Harlan's ship took its first serious hit while he was moving between decks to check on a damaged compartment. The explosion threw him against a bulkhead hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. He tasted blood and smoke at the same time. When he could stand again, he found two young sailors trying to fight a fire that was already spreading too fast. One of them was crying without making a sound. Harlan grabbed a hose and started giving orders in the calm voice he had used earlier on the young seaman. "We hold this line," he told them. "We hold it until someone tells us we can't." They worked beside him without speaking, their faces lit by the flames they were trying to kill. For a few minutes it felt like they might win. Then another explosion rocked the ship and the lights went out for good. In the water, men who had been thrown overboard or forced to jump found themselves in a nightmare of burning oil and floating debris. William's ship was sinking by the time he made it over the side. He swam away from the flames because staying near them meant burning or breathing smoke that seared the lungs. The water was warm and full of things he did not want to think about: oil, pieces of wood, other men who were calling for help they could not reach. He found a floating crate and held onto it with both arms, kicking slowly to keep his head above the surface. Around him the battle continued in flashes and thunder. He could see the shapes of ships burning and sinking, but he could not tell which ones were friendly anymore. The darkness had swallowed everything except the fire. On the beach, Joe and the other Marines had come fully awake at the first distant explosions. They stood or crouched at the edge of their positions, watching the horizon light up again and again. No one spoke much. The sound carried clearly across the water, the deep boom of heavy guns, the sharper crack of smaller ones, the occasional deeper roar that could only be a magazine going up. Joe felt Ray move closer to him without a word. They watched together as one ship after another turned into a pillar of flame. Someone nearby whispered that it had to be the Japanese fleet come to take back the island. Another voice said it was impossible, that their own ships were too strong. Joe said nothing. He simply watched and felt the same cold certainty he had felt in the landing craft the morning before. The war had just become much larger than any of them had expected. By the time the firing finally stopped, the sea north of Savo Island had become a graveyard. Burning oil slicks drifted with the current. Men clung to wreckage or swam toward the distant shore, unsure whether they were heading toward friends or enemies. On the surviving Allied ships, damage control parties worked in smoke and darkness, trying to keep their vessels afloat long enough to reach safer waters. William was pulled from the sea by a destroyer that had come looking for survivors. He sat on the deck wrapped in a blanket, shaking even though the night was warm, and could not stop seeing the burning ship he had left behind. Chief Harlan was not among those pulled from the water that night. He had stayed with his men until the end, helping the last of them over the side before the sea took the ship completely. When morning came, the Marines on the airfield woke to a changed world. The sea that had been full of friendly ships the day before was now scattered with the blackened hulks of cruisers that had gone down in the night. Smoke still rose from some of them. Small boats moved among the wreckage, looking for anyone still alive. Joe stood at the edge of the coral strip and watched one of those boats come in with men who had been in the water for hours. Their faces were gray with oil and exhaustion. Some of them could not walk without help. The Marines helped carry them to the aid station that had been set up near the runway. No one asked many questions. There would be time for that later. The loss was more than ships and men. It was the sudden, terrible understanding that the protective ring the Navy had promised was gone. The transports that had brought the Marines ashore were already pulling back, and now there was almost nothing left to guard the approaches or to bring fresh supplies. The airfield the Japanese had started building was in American hands, but holding it suddenly felt much harder than taking it had been. Joe thought about the easy landing, about the way they had walked onto the beach with almost no resistance, and felt a deep, quiet anger at how quickly everything had changed. Ray stood beside him without speaking, but Joe could feel the same thought in him. They were on their own now in a way they had not been the day before. Survivors from the sunken ships told stories in fragments. Men who had been on watch when the first torpedoes struck. Men who had stayed at their guns while the decks burned around them. Men who had jumped into burning water because staying aboard meant certain death. There were stories of courage that had made no difference in the end and stories of small kindnesses that had saved lives, a man giving his life jacket to a wounded shipmate, another staying behind to help others over the side even though he knew he would not make it himself. William listened to some of those stories while he sat on the beach waiting for orders. He kept thinking about the chief who had spoken to him so calmly the night before and wondered whether anyone had seen him after the ship went down. The educational truth of what had happened settled over everyone slowly. The Japanese had trained for night fighting in ways the Allies had not. Their torpedoes were better, their lookouts sharper in the dark, their captains more willing to close to point-blank range. The Allied ships had been caught in a trap they had not expected, and the cost had been paid in steel and in young men who would never write another letter home. For the Marines on the island, the lesson was even simpler and more personal. The ships that had carried them here and promised to protect them were gone. The airfield they had captured was now the only thing keeping them from being completely cut off. If they lost it, there would be no way to bring in food or ammunition or the medical supplies that would soon be needed. The island that had seemed almost empty the morning they landed was beginning to feel like a cage. William eventually found his way to one of the Marine positions near the airfield. He was still wearing the blanket someone had given him on the destroyer. Joe saw him sitting alone near the edge of the coral and brought him a canteen of water without being asked. They did not talk about the battle. There were no words that could hold what had happened out there in the dark. Instead, they sat together and watched the sea, each of them carrying the same quiet knowledge that the real fight for this place was only beginning. These men, the sailors who fought and died in the black water and the Marines who watched from shore, had given everything in a single night that changed the entire shape of the campaign. Their courage in the face of sudden, overwhelming loss, and the way they kept going even when the protection they had counted on disappeared, deserves to be remembered in its full, unfiltered depth. If these stories of ordinary men facing impossible odds in the dark have moved you, then I invite you to join our Patreon community. There you can access exclusive and censored video sections, bonus podcast episodes with deeper historical analysis, and connect directly with fellow history enthusiasts who want to explore the Pacific War at this same level of honesty and detail. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. By the time the sun was fully up on that terrible morning, the waters around Savo Island had earned a new and permanent name among the men who had survived them. They called it Iron Bottom Sound, because so much steel now lay on the sea floor. The name was spoken quietly, almost reverently, by sailors and Marines alike. It was not just a place on a map anymore. It was a reminder of how quickly everything could change in the dark, and of how much the men who had come to this island would have to endure before any of them could think about going home. The ghosts that had moved through the night were gone, but the consequences of their passing would shape every day that followed. In the thick darkness west of the captured airfield, a young Japanese soldier named Private Kenji Sato wiped sweat from his eyes and tried to keep his feet moving in time with the man ahead of him. The jungle had swallowed the column hours ago. Vines dragged at his uniform. Roots tripped him in the black. Every step carried the weight of his pack, his rifle, and the certainty Colonel Ichiki had given them all before they left the landing beaches. The Americans were soft, untested, and would run when real soldiers came at them in the night. Kenji had believed it on the ship. He had believed it when they first stepped into this strange, breathing grain. Now, with his legs shaking from the long march and his stomach empty for days, the words felt thinner than they had sounded back then. Colonel Kaineo Ichiki rode at the head of the column on a captured horse when the trail allowed it. He was a man who had tasted victory in China and believed the same spirit that had carried Japanese arms across Asia would break these Americans on this remote island. His orders were simple and absolute. Cross the small river that blocked the approach to the airfield, strike hard in the darkness, and finish what the Navy had started at Savo. He did not doubt the outcome. His men were veterans of hard fighting. The Marines on the other side of the water were boys who had only just learned to dig holes in the coral. Ichiki had told his officers the attack would be over before dawn. Most of them had nodded without question. Kenji had written a letter in his head during the march. He kept rewriting the same lines because he could not decide what to leave out. He wanted to tell his mother that the jungle was beautiful in a way no one back home could imagine, with flowers that glowed at night and birds that sounded like they were laughing. He did not want to tell her that the same jungle stole the strength from a man's legs and filled his dreams with fever. He did not want to tell her that some of the older soldiers had already begun to cough in a way that sounded wet and permanent. So he kept the letter simple in his mind. We are moving forward. The colonel says we will be home soon. He repeated it like a charm whenever the column halted and the darkness pressed close. On the Marine side of the river, the men who had landed days earlier were no longer the same boys who had waded ashore. The loss of the ships at Savo had changed something in all of them. They dug their holes deeper. They checked their ammunition more carefully. They spoke less about going home and more about holding what they had taken. Private Joe Harlan sat with his back against the coral lip of his fighting position and listened to the night sounds the way a farmer listens to weather. Ray was beside him again, cleaning his rifle by feel in the dark. Neither of them had slept well since the burning ships had lit the horizon. Joe kept thinking about the sailors they had pulled from the water, the way some of them had stared at nothing while the oil was washed from their faces. He wondered if the Japanese who had done that were the same ones moving toward them now. A runner came through the lines before midnight with word that listening posts had heard movement in the jungle across the river. The Marines did not need much warning. They had been waiting for something since the first night. Joe checked the belt in his machine gun one more time. The weapon felt heavier than it had on the ship. Ray offered him a cigarette without speaking. Joe took it, though he did not light it. They sat together in the dark and listened to the river moving over the sandbar that connected the two sides of the creek. The water made a soft, constant sound that almost covered the distant rustle of men moving through brush. Ichiki's column reached the edge of the river well before dawn. The colonel had planned to cross at the sandbar where the water was shallow enough for men to wade. He expected little resistance. His scouts had reported only a thin line of Marines on the far bank. What he could not know was how many of those Marines had spent the last night strengthening their positions with sandbags and barbed wire, or how many machine guns had been sighted to cover every approach to that narrow crossing. Ichiki gave the order to advance. His men moved forward in the dark with the quiet discipline of soldiers who had done this before in other places. The first shots came when the leading Japanese reached the sandbar. They were not the scattered fire of surprised sentries. They were the steady, controlled bursts of men who had been waiting. Kenji felt the air tear beside his head. He dropped into the shallow water without thinking and crawled forward because stopping meant dying where he stood. Around him other men were doing the same. Some rose and charged with the high, wild cry that had carried them through earlier battles. The Marines answered with everything they had. The night filled with the crack of rifles and the deeper chatter of machine guns. Tracers crossed the sandbar in red lines that lit the faces of men trying to cross. Joe Harlan kept his finger on the trigger of his machine gun until the barrel grew too hot to touch. He could see shapes moving in the water and on the far bank, men falling and others stepping over them to keep coming. Ray fed belts into the gun without being asked. When a Japanese soldier reached their side of the sandbar and lunged forward with a bayonet, Ray swung his rifle like a club and knocked the man back into the water. Joe did not have time to feel anything except the need to keep firing. The world had narrowed to the small arc of ground in front of their position and the men who kept trying to cross it. Kenji made it across the sandbar because the man in front of him took the bullets that would have hit him. He scrambled up the low bank on the Marine side and found himself in a world of noise and shadow. A Marine rose from a hole a few feet away. For a second they stared at each other across the darkness. Then the Marine swung his rifle and Kenji felt the stock catch him across the shoulder. He went down but did not let go of his own weapon. They grappled in the shallow fighting hole while the battle roared around them. Kenji could smell the other man's sweat and fear. He could feel the other man's breath on his face. For that moment they were not soldiers of different nations. They were simply two young men trying to kill each other because that was what they had been told to do. The fighting along the river lasted through the night in waves. Ichiki committed more of his men, convinced that one more push would break the line. The Marines held because they had no choice and because the men beside them refused to give ground. Small acts of courage kept the defense alive. A wounded Marine dragged himself back to his gun after being hit in the leg. Another passed ammunition to a position that had run dry even though it meant crossing open ground under fire. On the Japanese side, officers led charges with swords drawn, refusing to believe that these Americans would not break the way others had broken before. Kenji survived the first rush because he stayed low and moved when the firing slackened. He found himself beside a corporal who had been with the detachment since China. The older man was bleeding from a wound in his side but kept firing his rifle one-handed. When Kenji tried to help him, the corporal shook his head and told him to keep moving forward. "The colonel is watching," he said. His voice was calm, as if they were still on the training ground. By the time the sky began to lighten, the sandbar and the ground on both sides of the river were covered with the dead and dying. Ichiki's attack had spent itself against the Marine line. The colonel, wounded but still on his feet, tried to rally what remained of his men for one final effort. Some followed. Most could not. The Marines, exhausted and running low on ammunition, watched the last charges come and met them with the same steady fire that had held through the night. When the sun finally rose high enough to show the full cost, the river itself seemed to run red in places where bodies lay in the shallows. Joe Harlan sat with his back against the coral again, his hands shaking from hours of gripping the machine gun. Ray was still beside him, though neither of them had spoken for a long time. They watched as other Marines moved among the Japanese wounded, offering water where they could, ending suffering where they could not. Joe saw one Marine kneel beside a young Japanese soldier who could not have been much older than he was. The Marine gave the boy water from his own canteen and stayed with him until the end. There was no hatred in the act, only the quiet recognition that the boy on the ground had been someone's son the same way Joe was someone's son. On the Japanese side, the survivors who could still walk began to pull back into the jungle. Kenji helped the wounded corporal move away from the river. The older man was weaker now, his breathing shallow. Kenji kept talking to him about the village back home, about the fields that would need planting when they returned. He did not know if the corporal could hear him. He kept talking anyway because silence felt worse. Behind them the battlefield was quiet except for the occasional shot when a Marine found a Japanese soldier still fighting. The lesson Colonel Ichiki had meant to teach the Americans had become a lesson for his own men instead. The Americans would not run. They would not break at the first determined attack. They would fight in the dark and in the light, and they would make every yard of ground cost more than it was worth. The Marines who had held the line that night understood something new as well. The Japanese would not give up easily either. They would come again, and the next time they might come in greater numbers or with better preparation. The easy landing and the quick capture of the airfield had been only the beginning. The real war for this island was the kind that would be fought in small, brutal actions like the one at the river, where courage on both sides turned into something closer to endurance than glory. Joe wrote a letter that afternoon while the positions were being strengthened again. He told his mother that he was safe and that the men around him were good men. He did not tell her about the bodies in the river or about the way the young Japanese soldier had looked at him before he died. There were no words for that in any letter. He folded the paper carefully and put it in his pocket to be mailed when the chance came. Then he went back to his machine gun and checked the belt one more time. The men who fought at the Tenaru carried the memory of that night for the rest of their lives. Some spoke of it later. Most did not. What they had learned in those dark hours was that this war would not be decided by quick victories or by the belief that one side was inherently stronger than the other. It would be decided by who could endure the next attack, and the one after that, and the one after that, until the island itself decided there was nothing left to fight over. The bloody lesson at the river had only just begun to teach them how long that might take. The ferocity both sides showed that night revealed how much each had underestimated the other, and how many hidden elements of will, preparation, and quiet determination shaped even the smallest clashes in this war. If these stories of ordinary men pushed to their limits have stayed with you, then I think you will find real value in exploring the lesser-known operations that often decided such moments before the first shot was ever fired. I invite you to sign up for our free email newsletter, where you will receive the exclusive ebook The Shadow War, 5 top-secret operations that shaped World War II, along with regular deep-dive stories about espionage, hidden heroes, and the forgotten actions that changed the course of the conflict in ways most histories never mention. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. By the time the last of Ichiki's men had disappeared back into the jungle, the Marines on the airfield knew the campaign ahead would demand more from them than they had imagined when they first stepped onto the beach. The Japanese knew the same thing in a different way. Neither side would yield easily again. The island had begun to exact its price in blood and in the quiet courage of men who simply refused to break, and that price would only grow heavier with every day that followed. In the gray light before dawn on the captured airfield, a young Marine pilot named Lieutenant Tommy Ellis stood beside his battered Wildcat fighter and listened to the distant drone of an approaching Japanese plane. The sound was uneven, like a washing machine with a broken part, and the men on the field had already given it a name, Washing Machine Charlie. Tommy had learned to hate that sound more than any other. It meant another night of lost sleep, another scramble into the air with too little fuel and too many holes in his wings, another chance that this might be the morning he did not come back. He had written a letter to his wife the evening before, telling her that the food was holding up and that the men around him were the best he had ever known. He had not told her that he sometimes woke in the middle of the night certain he could hear his own engine failing, or that he kept a small photograph of her tucked inside his flight jacket where it could not be damaged by the rain that turned the runway into mud. Tommy touched the pocket now, feeling the edge of the picture through the fabric, then climbed into the cockpit because the drone was growing louder and the ground crews were already waving him to start his engine. The field the Marines had taken days earlier was no longer just a strip of coral. It had become the single most important piece of ground in the Southern Pacific, and everyone who lived on it knew it. The Japanese wanted it back because from here American planes could reach out and strike the ships bringing fresh troops and supplies to the enemy. The Americans needed it because without air cover the Marines on the ground would be bombed day and night, and the Japanese would be free to land whatever they wanted on the beaches. Tommy understood the larger picture in the same way a man understands the ocean while standing on its shore. He could see the waves, but he could not see the whole depth. What he knew for certain was that every time he got a plane into the air he was buying time for the men in the foxholes around the perimeter. Chief Mechanic Harlan moved between the parked fighters with the steady pace of a man who had already been working for hours. He was older than most of the pilots, a career Marine who had learned his trade on ships and in hangars long before this war began. His hands were stained with oil and grease that never quite washed away. When Tommy's engine coughed and sputtered on the first try, Harlan was already there with a rag and a quiet word. "She's tired, Lieutenant, same as the rest of us. Give her a moment and she'll remember what she's for." Tommy nodded without speaking. He trusted Harlan more than he trusted most officers. The chief had a way of making broken things work again, and in the early weeks on the island that skill had kept more planes flying than anyone cared to count. The first raid of the morning came in low and fast. Tommy was already airborne with 3 other Wildcats when the Japanese bombers appeared over the field. He climbed hard, the engine straining, and felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came before every fight. Below him the ground crews were still working on damaged planes even as the bombs began to fall. Harlan stayed beside one fighter that had taken shrapnel in the wing the day before, directing 2 younger mechanics as they patched the holes with whatever metal they could find. When a stick of bombs walked across the far end of the runway, Harlan did not flinch. He simply told the men to keep their heads down and keep working. "They can't hit what they can't see," he said, though everyone knew that was not true. The Japanese had been hitting the field almost every day since the Marines had taken it. In the air Tommy found himself in the middle of a swirling fight with enemy fighters that had come to escort the bombers. He had learned quickly that the Wildcat was slower than the Japanese planes but could take more punishment. He used that knowledge now, turning inside an attacker and firing a short burst that sent the enemy fighter smoking toward the sea. He did not watch it hit the water. There was no time. Another plane was already on his tail, and he had to dive and twist to shake it off. When he finally leveled out, his hands were shaking inside his gloves. He told himself it was the vibration of the engine. He knew better. Back on the ground, Harlan watched the fight through a pair of borrowed binoculars. He had learned to read the sky the way a farmer reads clouds. When one of the Wildcats began trailing smoke, he felt the same cold knot in his stomach that came every time a plane went down. He did not know the pilot personally, but he knew the man's ground crew. He knew they would be waiting at the edge of the runway, hoping. When the smoking fighter made it back and landed hard, bouncing once before settling, Harlan was already running toward it with a fire extinguisher and a stretcher team. The pilot climbed out on his own, his face pale but his voice steady when he thanked the men who helped him down. Harlan clapped him on the shoulder and said only, "She'll fly again tomorrow. You make sure you do too." The days blurred together in a cycle of scramble, fight, land, repair, and scramble again. Tommy began to measure time not by hours but by the number of missions he had survived. He flew combat air patrol over the field and over the waters where Japanese ships tried to bring reinforcements. He flew strikes against those ships when the Navy could spare the fuel and the bombs. Each time he took off, he carried the same private fear that this might be the day his luck ran out. He never spoke it out loud. Instead, he joked with the other pilots in the ready tent, shared what little food they had, and listened when a newer man needed to talk about home. One evening after a particularly bad raid, he found a young Navy pilot sitting alone behind the remains of a bombed-out hangar. The man was staring at a letter he had not yet opened. Tommy sat down beside him without asking and offered a cigarette. They smoked in silence for a while. Then the Navy pilot said, very quietly, that his wife had just had their first child and he had not been there to see it. Tommy did not offer empty comfort. He simply said, when this is over, you'll have stories to tell him that no other father will. It was the best he could do. Harlan's ground crews worked through the same raids and the same exhaustion. They slipped in shallow holes near the planes they were responsible for, because moving too far away meant they might not be there when a fighter came back damaged and needing immediate work. One night during a heavy rain, a young mechanic woke to find water rising in his hole. He climbed out and spent the rest of the night sitting on the wing of a plane, holding a tarp over the engine to keep it dry. In the morning, Harlan found him still there, soaked and shivering, but the plane was ready to fly. He did not scold the man for not sleeping. He simply handed him a cup of the bitter coffee they all pretended to like and told him to get some rest before the next scramble. Small kindnesses like that kept the crews going when the larger world offered nothing but more raids and more losses. The educational truth of their situation revealed itself in every mission. Without the planes taking off from this muddy strip, the Japanese would have owned the sky over the island and the waters around it. They could have bombed the Marines on the ground without opposition. They could have landed fresh troops and supplies whenever they chose. Every fighter that managed to get airborne, every bomber that found a Japanese ship and sent it to the bottom, bought another day for the men holding the perimeter. Tommy understood this when he attacked a transport loaded with soldiers and watched it burn. He understood it when he turned back an incoming raid and saw the Japanese planes jettison their bombs early rather than press through his fire. The cost was paid in sleepless nights, and friends who did not come back, and in the quiet knowledge that the field itself was as much a target as any ship at sea. One afternoon, Tommy returned from a patrol to find Harlan sitting on an ammunition crate, staring at a piece of shrapnel he had pulled from the wing of a plane that morning. The chief looked older than he had a week earlier. Tommy sat beside him and asked what was wrong. Harlan turned the jagged metal over in his hands and said, "Every time I patch one of these holes, I think about the man who has to fly through the next one. I keep wondering how many more patches she can take before she doesn't come home." Tommy did not have an answer. He reached into his pocket, took out the photograph of his wife, and showed it to the older man. "She's waiting," he said. "That's enough reason to keep patching." Harlan looked at the picture for a long moment, then nodded and tucked the shrapnel into his pocket like a reminder. They sat together until the sound of another approaching raid forced them both back to work. The pilots and ground crews of the Cactus Air Force lived in a world measured by the next scramble and the next repair. They flew planes that were patched with parts cannibalized from wrecks. They took off from a runway that could turn into a swamp after a single rain. They faced an enemy that seemed to have an endless supply of aircraft and pilots willing to die. Yet they kept the field breathing. They kept enough planes in the air to contest the sky, to strike at Japanese shipping, and to give the Marines on the ground a fighting chance. The courage required was not the kind that came in a single moment of glory. It was the courage of getting up after another night of lost sleep, of climbing into a damaged cockpit, of staying at a workbench while bombs fell nearby, and of doing it again the next day because stopping would mean losing everything. These men gave everything they had to keep a single muddy airfield alive in the middle of an ocean that wanted to swallow them. Their daily courage under constant attack, and the way they supported one another through exhaustion and loss, is the same spirit that defines so much of the Pacific War. If their story has moved you the way it moves me, then I think you will find real value in experiencing another powerful chapter of that same courage brought to life on screen. The film Midway, streaming now on Prime Video, captures the heart-stopping decisions and bravery of men fighting across these same waters. Or if you prefer something you can hold on to, there are excellent Pacific War books and commemorative memorabilia that let you connect more deeply with the sacrifices made here. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. By the time the sun set on another day of raids and repairs, the men on the field knew that tomorrow would bring the same cycle. The Japanese would come again. The field would be hit again. Planes would take off and some would not return. Yet as long as even a few fighters could get into the air and as long as the ground crews could keep them flying, the island would not fall. The Cactus Angels, as the pilots and their support crews came to be known, had turned a captured strip of coral into the beating heart of the campaign. And they would keep it beating for as long as there was breath left in any of them. In the fading light on a narrow, jungle-covered ridge south of the captured airfield, Colonel Merritt Edson stood with his back to a shattered tree and watched his raiders dig in for what he already knew would be the hardest night of their lives. The men called him Red Mike because of his hair and his temper, but on this evening his voice was quiet as he moved among them, checking positions, offering a word here and a nod there. He had led these men through raids and long marches, and they trusted him in the way soldiers trust a leader who has never asked them to do something he would not do himself. Tonight that trust would be tested in ways none of them could yet imagine. The ridge rose like a spine above the low ground that led to the airfield. If the Japanese broke through here, they would have a direct path to the strip the Marines had fought so hard to hold. Edson understood the stakes without needing maps or briefings. He had walked the ground himself, choosing the places where machine guns could cover the approaches and where his men could make a stand even if they were surrounded. He had told his officers that they would hold or they would die trying. There was no other choice. Private First Class Danny Ruiz knelt in a shallow fighting hole near the center of the ridge and tried to keep his hands from shaking as he checked the belt in his machine gun. He was 20 years old, barely out of training, and this was his first real fight on the island. The older raiders around him moved with the calm of men who had already seen too much. One of them, a sergeant named Mac, sat nearby sharpening his bayonet with slow, steady strokes. When Danny's hands fumbled with the ammunition, Mac reached over without a word and helped seat the belt properly. "Breathe slow, kid," he said. "They'll come when they come. We'll be here when they do." Danny nodded and tried to smile. He thought about the letter he had started writing to his mother the night before and wished he had finished it. There had been no time. Edson stopped at their position on his last walk along the line. He crouched beside the machine gun and looked out over the darkening ground below the ridge. "They'll try to come up the draws and through the low spots," he said quietly. "Keep your fire low and steady. Don't waste ammunition on shadows. When they get close, make every round count." He looked at Danny for a moment, then at Mac. "You two hold this spot. The rest of the line depends on it." Then he moved on, his silhouette disappearing into the shadows between the trees. Danny felt the weight of those words settle on him. He had never been responsible for anything this important before. As full darkness fell, the jungle below the ridge came alive with sound. The raiders listened to the movement of men and equipment, the occasional clink of metal, the low voices that carried farther than the Japanese probably intended. Edson had ordered no firing until the enemy was committed. The waiting was the hardest part. Danny sat with his back against the damp earth of the hole and listened to his own heartbeat. He thought about home, about the small town where he had grown up, about the girl he had promised to write every week. He wondered if she would still recognize him if he made it back. Mac must have sensed the direction of his thoughts because he spoke again, his voice low. "Whatever happens tonight, you stay with me. We look out for each other. That's how we get through." Danny nodded in the dark. It was the closest thing to comfort he had felt in days. The first Japanese probes came just after midnight. Small groups tested the flanks and the center, trying to find weak points. The raiders met them with disciplined fire that drove the attackers back into the jungle. Edson moved constantly, appearing at different positions, directing reserves, making sure no part of the line was left unsupported. When a Japanese grenade landed near one of the machine gun nests, a raider named Corporal Lewis threw himself on it without hesitation. The explosion was muffled by his body. Edson reached the position moments later. He helped pull Lewis clear, though there was nothing more to be done. For a brief moment he placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, then turned back to the fight. The line had to hold. The main assault came in waves. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers surged up the slopes, screaming and firing as they came. The raiders met them with everything they had. Machine guns rattled until their barrels glowed. Rifles cracked in the dark. Men fought hand to hand when the attackers reached the crest. Danny's gun jammed twice. Each time Mac cleared it with quick, sure movements while Danny covered them both with his pistol. When a Japanese officer reached their position waving a sword, Mac rose to meet him. The two men grappled at the lip of the hole until Mac drove his bayonet home. He fell back into the hole breathing hard, blood on his hands that was not his own. Danny stared at him for a second, then turned back to the gun because more shapes were moving in the darkness below. Edson appeared again near their position during a lull between waves. He was bleeding from a cut on his face but seemed unaware of it. He knelt between Danny and Mac and spoke calmly, as if they were still on a training field. "You're doing fine. Keep that gun talking. They're hurting worse than we are." Then he was gone again, moving to another threatened spot. Danny watched him go and felt something shift inside him. The fear was still there, but it had been joined by something else, a determination not to let this man down, not to let the men on either side of him down. He fed another belt into the gun and waited for the next wave. The fighting went on through the night in a blur of noise and darkness. At one point the Japanese broke through on the left flank and reached the edge of the ridge. Edson personally led a counterattack that drove them back, his voice cutting through the chaos as he directed fire and encouraged the men around him. Raiders who had been fighting for hours found new strength because their colonel was among them, refusing to yield an inch. In the center, Danny and Mac held their position even when ammunition ran low and they had to use captured Japanese weapons. When a wounded raider crawled toward them from another hole, Mac pulled him in and used his own shirt to bind the man's leg. There was no time for more. Another wave was already coming. By the time the sky began to lighten, the ridge was a scene of exhaustion and ruin. Bodies lay scattered across the slopes. The raiders who remained were hollow-eyed and covered in dirt and blood, but they still held their positions. Edson walked the line one more time, speaking to each surviving man. When he reached Danny and Mac, he stopped and looked at them for a long moment. "You held," he said simply. "That's all that matters." Danny tried to answer but found he had no voice left. He simply nodded. Mac managed a tired salute. Edson returned it and moved on. As full daylight revealed the cost, the raiders began to understand what they had done. The Japanese attack had been stopped cold on this narrow spine of ground. The airfield below remained in American hands. If the ridge had fallen, the entire position around Henderson Field would have been threatened. The stand had bought time, but it had taken almost everything the raiders had to give. Danny sat in his hole and looked at the faces of men he had fought beside through the night. Some were still there. Many were not. He thought about the letter he had not finished and wondered what he would write now. There were no words for the things he had seen and done in the dark. Mac cleaned his rifle with slow, deliberate movements, the same way he had sharpened his bayonet hours earlier. When he finished, he offered Danny the last of his water. "We made it," he said. It was not a question. Danny took the canteen and drank. The water tasted of metal and smoke, but it was the best thing he had ever tasted. Around them other survivors were doing the same small things, sharing what little they had left, helping the wounded, quietly counting the cost. Edson stood at the highest point of the ridge and looked out over the ground they had held. His face was streaked with dirt and blood, but his eyes were clear. He had asked his men to do the impossible, and they had done it. The ridge had not broken. Neither had they. The men who stood on Edson's ridge that morning had faced one of the most determined attacks of the entire campaign. They had fought through the night against waves of infantry that kept coming even when the cost became unbearable. Their courage had not been the loud kind that comes with parades. It had been the quiet, stubborn kind that refuses to give ground even when every instinct screams to run. In holding that narrow strip of jungle, they had kept the airfield safe for another day, and in doing so they had kept the entire American presence on the island alive a little longer. These raiders endured hours of close combat that tested every limit of human endurance and will. The raw reality of what they faced, the darkness, the hand-to-hand fighting, the sheer determination on both sides, lives on in photographs and footage that most platforms will never show because the images are simply too stark and too personal. If the courage of these men has stayed with you, then I want to share something that lets you see the unfiltered truth of what they endured. There is a special digital collection available that gathers rare, uncensored photographs and historical footage from the Guadalcanal campaign, material that captures the harsh realities of jungle warfare and close combat in ways no ordinary documentary can. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. By the time the sun was fully up, the ridge had become both a graveyard and a symbol. The raiders who remained knew they had been part of something that would be remembered long after the war ended. They had held when holding seemed impossible. They had refused to break when breaking would have been the easier choice. And because they had stood their ground through that long and terrible night, the airfield below them continued to breathe, and the campaign for the island continued with it. The thin line they had defended had proven strong enough to carry the weight of everything that would come after. On a cruiser cutting through the black waters north of Guadalcanal, a young radar operator named Petty Officer First Class Ellis kept his eyes fixed on the glowing screen in front of him and tried to steady his breathing. The sea around the ship was calm, but the air inside the compartment felt thick with the tension of men who had already lost too much in these same waters. Ellis had been on watch for hours. His hands rested lightly on the controls, but his mind kept drifting to the letter he had written earlier that evening and tucked into his pocket. He had told his wife that he was safe and that the ship was strong. He had not told her that every time he closed his eyes he still saw the burning hulks from the night the Japanese had caught them by surprise. Tonight felt different. The radar was new to many of the men, and the orders had been clear. This time they were hunting. The sailors on the American ships moving through Iron Bottom Sound carried more than weapons and orders. They carried the memory of the disaster at Savo, when Japanese cruisers had appeared like ghosts and left the sea littered with burning wreckage. That night had left a deep mark on every man who had survived it. Some spoke of it in quiet voices during the long watches. Others kept their thoughts to themselves, staring at the dark water and wondering when their turn would come. On this night, the mood was different. There was a quiet determination in the way men checked their stations and spoke to one another. They had trained hard since then. They had learned new ways to fight in the dark. And they were determined that this time the outcome would be different. Chief Petty Officer Harlan moved through the compartments of his cruiser with the steady pace of a man who had spent too many nights at sea. He stopped at each gun crew, speaking softly to the young sailors who gripped their weapons too tightly. "Keep your heads," he told them. "Watch your sector. When the word comes, do your job and trust the man next to you. He had seen fear before, and he knew how to quiet it without making a show of it. One young loader was shaking slightly as he stacked shells. Harlan placed a hand on his shoulder and left it there for a moment. "You're not alone up here," he said. The young man nodded and steadied himself. Small gestures like that had kept crews together through worse nights than this one. On the bridge, the captain stood with his officers, studying the dark horizon. He had received reports of Japanese ships moving toward the island, likely bringing reinforcements or planning another bombardment of the airfield. The Marines on Guadalcanal were already stretched thin. Every ship that reached the beaches with supplies meant another day the airfield could stay operational. Every Japanese ship turned back meant one less chance for the enemy to land fresh troops or rain shells on the men holding the perimeter. The captain understood the larger stakes, but he also understood the personal ones. The men under his command had families waiting at home. They had already buried too many shipmates. Tonight he would ask them to risk everything again, and he knew the cost if they failed. Ellis suddenly sat up straighter at his radar screen. Blips had appeared where there should have been only empty water. He called the information to the bridge in a voice that stayed calm even though his heart was racing. The shapes were moving fast, closing the distance. On the American ships, men moved to their battle stations without panic. This time they had the advantage of surprise on their side. The Japanese force did not yet know they were being watched. The first American guns opened fire with a roar that rolled across the water like thunder. Shells arced through the darkness and found their targets. On one Japanese cruiser, men who had been preparing for an easy approach to the island suddenly found themselves under fire from an enemy they had not expected to meet. The battle that followed was fought at close range in the dark, with ships maneuvering wildly to bring their guns to bear. On the American cruiser where Ellis served, the deck shook with each broadside. He stayed at his station, feeding information to the gunners as fast as he could read the screen. The Japanese ships returned fire, and soon the night was lit by the flashes of exploding shells and the glow of burning vessels. One American destroyer took a hit that sent flames shooting up its superstructure. Men on nearby ships watched in horror as their shipmates fought the fire while still trying to keep their vessel in the fight. On one of the burning ships, a young ensign stayed at his post directing damage control even as smoke filled the compartment. He kept giving orders until the smoke took his voice, then kept pointing until others understood what needed to be done. Chief Harlan was below decks when the first hits came. He felt the ship lurch and heard the sound of rushing water. He grabbed a damage control party and led them toward the flooding compartment. In the dim emergency lighting, they worked in waist-deep water, passing sandbags and shoring up bulkheads while shells continued to fall around them. One of the younger sailors slipped and went under. Harlan reached down without hesitation and pulled him back to his feet. "Stay with me," he said. "We finish this together." They kept working until the water was under control. When they finally climbed back to the main deck, the battle was still raging, but their ship was still fighting. On the Japanese side, the surprise had been complete. Their commanders had expected to find only a few American ships guarding the approaches to Guadalcanal. Instead, they found a force ready and waiting. Some of their ships turned to engage while others tried to press on toward the island with their cargo of troops and supplies. The American cruisers and destroyers used their radar advantage to keep the range and pour fire into the Japanese formation. One Japanese cruiser was hit repeatedly and began to list heavily. Men on her decks fought to keep her afloat while others abandoned ship into the dark water. The sea around the burning vessels was filled with oil and debris and the cries of men trying to stay alive. Ellis watched the radar screen as the Japanese formation began to break apart. Some ships were retreating. Others were still trying to fight their way through. He called out new bearings and ranges, his voice steady even as the ship around him shuddered from near misses. On the gun decks, sailors loaded and fired until their arms ached and their ears rang from the constant noise. One loader, a man who had joined the Navy straight from a small farm, kept working even after a fragment of shell casing cut his arm. He tied a rag around the wound with his teeth and kept passing ammunition. When a friend tried to send him below, he shook his head and said, "They need every hand up here. I'm staying." The gun kept firing. As the battle reached its height, the American force began to press their advantage. The Japanese ships that had been heading for Guadalcanal were forced to turn away or risk destruction. The waters of Iron Bottom's Sound became a confusion of burning ships, exploding shells, and men struggling in the dark. On one American cruiser that had taken heavy damage, the captain made the decision to stay in the fight rather than withdraw. He knew that every minute his ship remained on station meant another minute the Japanese could not reach the beaches. His crew responded with the same determination. Even as fires burned on the decks, they kept their guns in action. When the firing finally slackened, the sea was littered with the wreckage of ships from both sides. The Japanese force had been turned back. They had not reached the waters off Guadalcanal with their reinforcements. The American ships that survived began the slow work of damage control and searching for survivors. On Ellis's cruiser, men moved through the compartments checking for flooding and wounded shipmates. Harlan led another damage control team, his voice calm as he directed the work. When they found a young sailor trapped under fallen debris, Harlan stayed with him, talking quietly until the others could free him. The young man was badly hurt, but he was alive. Harlan helped carry him to the aid station and then returned to his work without a word. On the beaches of Guadalcanal, the Marines who had been listening to the distant thunder of the guns through the night began to understand what had happened. At first light they saw the smoke rising from the water and the shapes of damaged ships limping toward safer waters. Word spread quickly through the positions around the airfield. The Navy had turned back a Japanese force in the dark. It was not a complete victory. Too many American ships had been damaged or lost, but it was the first time since Savo that the sailors had met the enemy at night and come away with the advantage. For the exhausted Marines holding the perimeter, the news brought a small but powerful lift. Supplies might still reach them. The airfield might remain safe from bombardment for another day. The men who had felt abandoned after the earlier naval disaster began to believe that their brothers at sea were still fighting for them. Ellis stood on the deck of his cruiser as the sun rose over the sound. The water was calm again, but the evidence of the night's fighting was everywhere. He thought about the letter in his pocket and wondered what he would add to it now. He had seen men die and men fight on when they had every reason to give up. He had felt the ship shake under fire and watched the radar screen turn from threat to victory. The fear was still there, but it had been joined by something else, a quiet pride in what they had accomplished together. He touched the pocket where the letter rested and allowed himself a small moment of hope that the words he had written might still be true. Chief Harlan sat for a few minutes on an ammunition crate, his hands black with grease and soot. A young sailor brought him a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. Harlan took it without complaint and drank it slowly. Around him, men who had fought through the night were checking their weapons and tending their wounds. Some spoke in low voices about the friends they had lost. Others simply stared at the sea, trying to make sense of what they had survived. Harlan looked at them and felt the same mix of exhaustion and resolve that had carried him through other battles. They had redeemed something tonight, not the full cost of Savo, but a piece of it. They had shown that American sailors could fight in the dark and win. The battle at Cape Esperance had been costly on both sides, but it marked a shift in the long struggle for control of the waters around Guadalcanal. For the first time, the American Navy had used its radar advantage effectively in a night action and had turned back a Japanese force that had been heading for the island. The psychological effect on the men fighting on the ground was immediate and real. They had watched their naval support suffer devastating losses only weeks earlier. Now they saw that their ships could still fight and still protect them. That small change in morale mattered more than any map or report could measure. It gave the Marines on the airfield and in the foxholes around it one more reason to believe they could hold. The sailors who had fought through that night carried the memory of it for the rest of their lives. Some spoke later of the confusion and the courage. Others kept their thoughts private, writing letters home that could never fully describe what they had seen and done. The young loader who had kept working despite his wound received a commendation he never talked about. The ensign who had stayed on his burning ship was remembered by his crew long after the war ended. Chief Harlan continued to serve on damaged ships, quietly keeping men steady through worse nights than this one. Ellis returned to his radar screen on the next patrol, watching the dark water and hoping the shapes that appeared would always be friendly. These men fought in waters that had already claimed too many of their shipmates, and they turned a moment of potential disaster into the first real American naval success of the campaign. Their courage under fire, their refusal to break even when their ships were burning around them, and the quiet ways they supported one another through the long night deserve to be remembered with the same care that went into living them. If these stories of ordinary sailors rising to extraordinary challenges have stayed with you the way they stay with me, then I would be grateful if you would consider leaving a small tip, as little as $1, on Ko-Fi. Every contribution helps support the research, the writing, and the dedication it takes to bring these forgotten human stories of courage and sacrifice to light for the generations who will come after us. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. By the time the last damaged American ship had limped out of Iron Bottom Sound, the balance in the campaign had shifted in ways that no one could yet measure. The Japanese had been denied their reinforcements for at least one more night. The Marines on Guadalcanal had been given one more day to strengthen their positions and keep the airfield breathing. And the sailors who had fought in the dark had proven to themselves and to the men on shore that they were still in the fight. The waters around the island would see more battles, more losses, and more moments of desperate courage. But after Cape Esperance, the men who sailed those waters carried with them the knowledge that they could win in the dark, and that knowledge would carry them through the harder nights still to come. In the steaming darkness of the jungle west of the American perimeter, a young Japanese soldier named Private Hiroshi Sato wiped the sweat from his eyes and tried to keep his feet moving forward through the thick mud. The column had been marching for days, and every step felt heavier than the last. His pack cut into his shoulders. His boots were soaked through. Around him, other men walked in silence, their faces gaunt from fever and hunger. They had been told this would be the great push that ended the American presence on the island once and for all. Admiral Yamamoto himself had committed ships, planes, and thousands of soldiers to the task. Hiroshi believed in the cause. He had believed in it when they first landed on the far side of the island. But the jungle had already begun to take its toll, and the hardest fighting still lay ahead. Hiroshi carried a small photograph of his family tucked inside his uniform. He had looked at it every night since the march began, tracing the faces of his parents and younger sister with his finger in the dark. He had written letters in his mind during the long days of walking, letters he knew he might never be able to send. In them he described the strange beauty of the island, the way the sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, the sound of birds that called like they were laughing at the men below. He never wrote about the reality of the march, the way men collapsed from exhaustion and were left behind, the constant battle against malaria and dysentery, the growing realization that their commanders had underestimated how difficult it would be to move a large force through this terrain. Hiroshi kept those thoughts to himself. He was a soldier. He had been taught that complaining solved nothing. Far to the north, in the headquarters where the great plans were made, Admiral Yamamoto studied reports and maps with the quiet intensity of a man who understood the stakes. This offensive was meant to be decisive. The Americans had held the airfield for too long. Their planes were interfering with Japanese supply lines and striking at convoys bringing reinforcements. If the airfield could be retaken or at least neutralized, the balance in the southern Solomons would shift permanently in Japan's favor. Yamamoto had gathered every available ship, every available plane, and every soldier who could be spared. The plan called for a massive coordinated attack, airstrikes to soften the American defenses, naval forces to cut off their supplies, and a ground assault by fresh troops to overrun the perimeter and capture the strip itself. It was the largest effort yet made to dislodge the Americans from Guadalcanal. Success would mean the end of the enemy foothold. Failure would mean something far darker. On the American side, the men holding the lines around Henderson Field could feel the change in the air. The Cactus Air Force pilots who had been flying daily missions against Japanese shipping and incoming raids noticed the increase in enemy activity. Ground crews worked through the nights repairing planes that returned with more holes than seemed possible. On the ridges and in the foxholes, Marines strengthened their positions with extra sandbags and barbed wire, knowing that something larger was coming. Private First Class Danny Ruiz, who had survived the long night on Edson's Ridge weeks earlier, sat with his back against the damp earth of his fighting hole and listened to the distant drone of Japanese planes. His hands were steady now in a way they had not been during his first days on the island. The fear was still there, but it had settled into something quieter and more useful, a readiness to do what needed to be done when the moment arrived. Danny had received a letter from home the week before. His mother had written about the small things, the garden coming in, the neighbor's dog that still waited at the end of the road every afternoon. He had read it by the light of a small fire and then folded it carefully and tucked it into his pocket. He did not write back immediately. There were no words that could explain what the island had become. Instead, he spent his evenings checking his rifle and talking quietly with the men around him. One evening a new replacement sat down beside him, a young Marine who had arrived only days earlier and still carried the clean look of someone who had not yet seen real fighting. The kid asked Danny what it was like when the Japanese came in force. Danny thought for a moment before answering. "They keep coming," he said. "Even when you think they can't. You just keep firing until they stop or you run out of ammunition. Then you use whatever you have left." The young Marine nodded and did not ask any more questions. Danny offered him a cigarette from his dwindling supply. They smoked together in silence until the sound of another raid forced them back to their positions. The Japanese troops moving through the jungle were suffering in ways their commanders could not fully see from afar. The march to reach the American lines was longer and harder than anyone had anticipated. Supplies ran low. Men fell ill and were left to catch up or die where they fell. Hiroshi's unit lost nearly a third of its strength before they even reached the forward positions. At night they lay on the wet ground and listened to the sounds of the jungle, wondering how close they were to the enemy and whether the planes they heard overhead were friend or foe. One evening Hiroshi shared the last of his rice with a soldier who had been coughing for days. The man could barely eat, but he accepted the food with a quiet nod. In return, he offered Hiroshi a small piece of dried fish he had been saving. They ate together without speaking, two strangers bound by the same impossible task. Moments like that kept them moving when everything else told them to stop. As the Japanese forces drew closer to the American perimeter, the tension on both sides grew sharper. Yamamoto's air groups began striking the airfield with greater frequency and intensity. The Cactus pilots flew mission after mission, intercepting bombers and fighting off escort fighters even when they were outnumbered. On the ground, the Marines watched the sky and prepared for the infantry assault they knew was coming. Danny and the men around him dug their positions deeper and checked their ammunition. They had learned from earlier fights that the Japanese would come at night, using the darkness and the terrain to get as close as possible before launching their attacks. The waiting was the hardest part. Every sound in the jungle could be the enemy moving into position. Every hour that passed without an attack only increased the sense that something massive was building. When the offensive finally broke, it came in waves of air raids followed by ground assaults aimed at key points along the perimeter. Japanese artillery and mortars opened up first, pounding the American lines. Then the infantry surged forward through the darkness. On the ridges south of the airfield, Danny's unit met the first wave with steady fire. The Japanese soldiers came on despite the losses, climbing over their own dead to keep moving. Danny fired until his rifle grew hot in his hands. Around him other Marines did the same. Some positions were overrun in the first rush, only to be retaken in desperate counterattacks. The fighting was close and brutal. Men grappled in the mud. Grenades were thrown at point-blank range. Through it all, the Japanese kept coming, driven by orders and by the belief that this was the moment that would decide everything. Hiroshi was in one of the assault waves that reached the edge of the American positions. He had been running and firing for what felt like hours. His uniform was torn and covered in mud. Around him other soldiers were falling, but the momentum of the attack carried him forward. He saw an American machine gun position ahead and threw himself into a shallow depression to catch his breath. A comrade landed beside him, breathing hard. For a moment they looked at each other without speaking. Then the other man nodded once and rose to continue the advance. Hiroshi followed. They reached the machine gun nest together and fought hand to hand with the Marines who held it. In the chaos, Hiroshi felt a sudden sharp pain in his side but kept moving. He did not know if he had been hit by a bullet or a bayonet. There was no time to check. The only thing that mattered was staying on his feet and keeping the attack moving. On the American side, the defenders were being pushed to their limit. The Cactus Air Force flew constant missions to support the ground troops, strafing Japanese concentrations and bombing their approach routes. Pilots took off from the muddy strip under fire and returned with their planes damaged and low on fuel. Ground crews worked through the raids to keep the planes flying. One young mechanic stayed at his post even after shrapnel from a nearby bomb struck his arm. He tied a rag around the wound and kept working because the pilots needed every aircraft that could still get into the air. The airfield itself became a target again and again, but the Americans refused to abandon it. They knew that if the strip fell, everything else on the island would fall with it. The Japanese offensive reached its height over several nights of intense fighting. Yamamoto's forces threw everything they had into the assault. Fresh troops landed under cover of darkness. Airstrikes continued without pause. On the ground, the attackers pressed against the American lines with a determination born of desperation and belief in final victory. Hiroshi's unit fought its way onto one of the ridges overlooking the airfield. For a brief time it seemed as though they might break through. But the American defense held. Marines who had been fighting for weeks without rest refused to yield. They counterattacked with whatever they had left, rifles, bayonets, even entrenching tools when ammunition ran low. The line bent but did not break. As the days passed and the Japanese attacks lost momentum, the cost of the offensive became clear on both sides. The Japanese troops who had marched through the jungle with such high hopes were exhausted and decimated. Many of those who survived the initial assaults found themselves cut off or pinned down with no way to resupply. Hiroshi lay in a shallow hole on the ridge he had helped capture, his wound throbbing and his strength fading. He thought about the photograph in his pocket and wondered if he would ever see his family again. Around him other survivors were doing the same, some writing letters they knew might never be sent, others simply staring into the darkness and waiting for whatever came next. On the American side, the Marines who had held the perimeter looked out over the ground they had defended and felt a mixture of relief and grim understanding. They had survived the largest Japanese effort yet made to drive them from the island. But they also knew the cost had been terrible. Positions that had been held by friends were now occupied by the dead. The airfield had been damaged again and again, yet it still functioned. The Cactus pilots who had flown through the worst of the raids gathered in small groups to share what little food they had and to remember those who had not returned. One pilot wrote a short letter to the family of a wingman who had been lost over the jungle. He kept it simple. He fought bravely to the end. We will not forget him. The October offensive had been Yamamoto's great gamble to end the American presence on Guadalcanal. It had come closer to success than anyone on the American side cared to admit. The Japanese had thrown massive resources into the effort, ships, planes, and thousands of soldiers who endured unimaginable hardship to reach the battlefield. For a time it had seemed as though the weight of that effort might crush the thin American line. But the defenders had held. The airfield had remained in American hands. And the Japanese force that had been meant to deliver the final blow was left exhausted and unable to sustain the attack. These men on both sides, Japanese soldiers who marched through hell to reach the fight and American Marines and airmen who refused to yield when everything seemed lost, showed a level of endurance and courage that went far beyond orders or training. Their stories of quiet resilience, of small acts of humanity even in the midst of the worst fighting, and of the personal cost of holding or attacking a single muddy airfield deserve to be explored in their full, unfiltered depth. If the bravery and sacrifice of these ordinary men pushed to their absolute limits has stayed with you, then I invite you to join our Patreon community. There you can access exclusive and censored video sections, bonus podcast episodes with deeper historical analysis, raw footage, and stories that go further than we can share here, and connect directly with a passionate group of fellow history enthusiasts who want to explore the Pacific War with this same honesty and detail. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. By the time the last Japanese attacks faded and the survivors on both sides began to count their losses, the campaign for Guadalcanal had entered a new and even more desperate phase. Yamamoto's great push had failed to achieve its goal, but it had come close enough to show both sides how much more the island would demand before either could claim victory. The Japanese had shown they could still mount a massive coordinated offensive. The Americans had shown they could absorb that blow and still hold the one piece of ground that mattered most, the airfield. The men who had lived through those days and nights would carry the memory of them for the rest of their lives. And the island itself, soaked in rain and blood, would continue to test every soldier and sailor who set foot on it until one side or the other finally broke. In the black hours before dawn on a low rise south of Henderson Field, Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone knelt behind his machine gun and listened to the jungle. The sound was wrong. It was not the usual night chorus of insects and distant birds. It was the low, steady rustle of many men moving through the undergrowth, the occasional clink of equipment, the murmured voices that carried farther than the Japanese soldiers probably intended. Basilone had been in the Corps long enough to know what that sound meant. He checked the belt in his gun one more time, felt the cool metal under his fingers, and spoke quietly to the two young Marines sharing the position with him. "Stay low until they're close," he said. "Let them think they've got us surprised. Then we make every round count." His voice was calm, the same steady tone he used when teaching new men how to strip and clean a weapon back in the States. One of the Marines, a kid named Private First Class Rivera, nodded without speaking. His hands were steady on the gun, but Basilone could see the tightness in his jaw. The other man, Corporal Hayes, was older and quieter. He had already seen too much on this island. He simply checked his rifle and waited. Basilone had come to Guadalcanal with the 1st Marine Division and had quickly earned a reputation as a man who could make a machine gun sing. He was not the loudest or the flashiest. He was the one who stayed at his post when others might have looked for cover, the one who moved between positions under fire to keep the guns talking. On this night the Japanese were coming in strength again, part of the great push their commanders had ordered to crush the American beachhead once and for all. Basilone did not know the larger plan. He knew only that the strip of ground in front of his position had to be held, because behind it lay the airfield that kept the whole American presence on the island alive. The first wave hit just before the sky began to lighten. Japanese soldiers surged out of the darkness in a wave of fire and noise. Basilone's gun opened up immediately, the tracer rounds cutting bright lines through the night. He swung the weapon in short, controlled bursts, walking the fire across the advancing line. Around him other guns joined in. The night filled with the crack of rifles and the deeper chatter of machine guns. Rivera fed belts into Basilon's gun without being asked, his movements quick and sure despite the fear that showed in his eyes. Hayes moved between their position and the one next to it, carrying extra ammunition and shouting encouragement to the men who were beginning to waver. The Japanese kept coming. They had been told this was the final effort, the attack that would drive the Americans into the sea. They advanced through their own casualties, some of them firing as they ran, others simply charging with fixed bayonets. Basilone felt the ground shake under the impact of mortar rounds. A shell landed close enough to shower their position with dirt and fragments. He kept firing. When the belt ran out, he cleared the gun with quick, practiced movements and slapped in a fresh one. Rivera was already feeding the next belt before Basilone had to ask. In the red glow of the tracers, Basilone could see the young Marine's face, pale but determined. He gave Rivera a quick nod. "Good work. Keep it coming." The first wave broke against the Marine line but did not stop. More Japanese soldiers pressed forward, using the bodies of their fallen comrades for cover. Basilone's gun grew hot in his hands. He could smell the cordite and the burned metal. When the gun finally jammed from the heat and the dirt, he did not hesitate. He pulled the bolt back, cleared the obstruction with his bare fingers, and had it firing again within seconds. Hayes appeared beside him with a canteen. "Drink," he said. Basilone took a quick swallow and handed it back. "You too," he told the corporal. "We're not done yet." As the fighting intensified, Basilone began moving between positions. The Japanese had managed to get close on the left flank, and one of the Marine guns had fallen silent. He grabbed extra ammunition and ran through the darkness, bullets snapping past his head. When he reached the silenced gun, he found the crew down. One man was dead. The other was wounded and trying to crawl back to cover. Basilone pulled the wounded Marine to safety, then took over the gun himself. He swung it toward the advancing Japanese and opened fire. The weapon had been damaged, but it still worked. He kept it talking until the immediate threat passed, then helped the wounded man back toward the aid station while another Marine took over the position. By the time he returned to his original gun, the Japanese had launched another wave. Rivera was still there, firing steadily. His face was streaked with dirt and sweat, but his hands never faltered. Basilone took over the gun again and told Rivera to get some water. The young Marine shook his head. "I'm staying with you, Sergeant." Basilone did not argue. He simply nodded and kept firing. In the lulls between waves, he spoke quietly to the men around him, checking on their ammunition, making sure no one was left alone. He told stories from training, small things that made the night feel less endless. One man laughed at a joke about a drill instructor back in the States. The sound was thin and strained, but it was still a laugh. The Japanese attack reached its height in the darkest hours before dawn. They came in greater numbers than before, supported by mortars and machine guns of their own. The Marine line bent under the pressure. Several positions were overrun. Men fought hand to hand in the darkness. Basilone's gun was one of the few still firing steadily on that sector of the line. He moved it twice when the Japanese threatened to flank the position, carrying the heavy weapon himself while Rivera and Hayes covered him. Each time he set it up again in a new spot and resumed firing. The Japanese soldiers who reached the Marine positions found themselves facing a wall of fire that did not slacken. At one point the gun jammed again under the relentless use. Basilone worked on it in the dark while bullets kicked up dirt around him. His hands were burned from the hot barrel, but he did not stop. Rivera stayed beside him, feeding ammunition and watching for threats. When the gun finally fired again, Basilone let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. He looked at Rivera and said, "We're still in this." The young Marine nodded. In that moment, with the battle raging around them, the words felt like a promise. As the sky began to show the first hint of gray, the Japanese attacks finally began to lose momentum. Their waves grew smaller. The men who reached the Marine lines were exhausted and often wounded. Many simply collapsed when they met the final defensive fire. Barcelone kept his gun firing until the last assault broke. Then he sat back against the sandbags and let the weapon cool. His hands were shaking from exhaustion and from the constant recoil. Around him the other survivors were doing the same, checking their weapons, tending their wounds, staring at the ground in front of them where the dead lay in the growing light. Hayes appeared again with water and a quiet word. "You kept us alive, Sergeant." Barcelone shook his head. "We kept each other alive. That's how this works." He looked at Rivera, who was sitting with his back to the sandbags, eyes closed but still gripping his rifle. The young Marine had not left his side through the entire night. Barcelone reached over and gently pried the rifle from his hands. "Rest now," he said. "You did good." Rivera opened his eyes and managed a small smile before exhaustion pulled him under. When full daylight came, the cost of the night was clear. The Japanese had thrown everything they had at this sector of the line in their desperate attempt to reach the airfield. They had come close. Several times the Marines had been pushed back to their last positions. But the line had held. Barcelone's machine gun, and the men who kept it firing, had been at the center of the defense in this critical area. Without that steady fire, the Japanese might have broken through and reached the airfield itself. The entire American presence on the island would have been in danger. Barcelone walked the line after the fighting ended, checking on his men and helping move the wounded. He stopped at each position, offering water or a quiet word. Some of the men he had fought beside through the night were gone. Others were wounded but still alive. He made sure every survivor knew they had done something extraordinary. In the quiet moments between tasks, he thought about the young men who had looked to him for leadership. He thought about Rivera, who had stayed at his side without complaint. He thought about Hayes, who had kept moving ammunition even when his own strength was gone. These were the men who had made the difference. Not one hero standing alone, but a small group of ordinary Marines who had refused to break when everything around them was falling apart. The night Henderson Field almost fell had tested every man who stood on that line. It had demanded more than training or orders could provide. It had required the kind of quiet courage that shows itself in small actions, staying at a gun when the barrel is too hot to touch, carrying ammunition through fire, refusing to leave a wounded comrade behind. Barcelone had been at the center of that courage, but he had not stood there alone. The men around him had given everything they had, and together they had held the ground that mattered most. These ordinary Marines, pushed to the absolute edge of human endurance, showed what individual resolve and loyalty to one another could achieve when everything seemed lost. Their story, and the hidden courage that turned a desperate night into a stand that helped save the airfield, is part of the larger shadow war of will and sacrifice that decided so many moments in this conflict. If these accounts of ordinary men rising to impossible challenges have stayed with you, then I think you will find real value in exploring the lesser-known operations and hidden heroes that shaped battles like this one. I invite you to sign up for our free email newsletter, where you will receive the exclusive ebook The Shadow War, 5 top-secret operations that shaped World War II, along with regular deep-dive stories about espionage, forgotten heroes, and the quiet actions that changed the course of the war in ways most histories never mention. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. By the time the sun was fully up and the last of the Japanese survivors had disappeared back into the jungle, the men who had held the line knew they had been part of something that would be remembered. They had faced the largest and most determined attack yet made against Henderson Field, and they had not broken. Barcelone and the Marines who fought beside him that night had turned what could have been the end of the American presence on the island into one more day of survival. The airfield still stood. The planes could still fly. And the men who had lived through the darkness had proven, once again, that courage is not measured by the size of the moment but by the willingness to stay when every instinct says to run. The campaign was far from over, but on this narrow strip of ground the line had held, and that was enough to carry them forward into whatever came next. On the flight deck of a carrier pushing through heavy seas toward the Solomons, a young pilot named Lieutenant Graves stood beside his dauntless dive bomber and felt the wind cut through his flight jacket. The ship rolled beneath his feet. Around him other planes were being armed and fueled under the harsh glare of work lights. Graves had flown missions before, but this one felt different. Word had spread through the task force that Admiral Halsey had taken command. The old caution was gone. The orders were simple and direct: find the Japanese carriers and hit them hard. No more waiting for perfect conditions. No more pulling back when the enemy appeared. Halsey wanted the fight brought to them. Graves checked the straps on his parachute one more time and tried not to think about the men who had not come back from earlier strikes. He thought instead about the Marines on Guadalcanal who were still holding on by their fingernails. Every bomb his squadron could put on a Japanese flight deck meant one less raid those men on the island would have to endure. He climbed into the cockpit, gave a thumbs up to the plane captain, and waited for the signal to launch. The deck vibrated as the ship turned into the wind. One by one the planes roared down the deck and lifted into the gray morning sky. Graves followed them, climbing through the clouds and setting course for the last reported position of the enemy fleet. Far to the south, on the muddy ridges around Henderson Field, the Marines who had survived the October offensive were still digging in and repairing damage from the last Japanese push. They had heard rumors that a new admiral was in charge now, a man who believed in attacking rather than just holding on. The news had spread quietly through the foxholes and gun positions. It did not change the mud or the hunger or the constant threat of air raids, but it changed something in the way men spoke to one another. There was a new edge to their voices when they talked about the Japanese. If the Navy was finally going to take the fight to the enemy instead of just reacting, then maybe the endless pressure on the island would ease. Private Danny Ruiz sat with his back against the sandbags of his position and listened to the distant drone of Japanese planes. He thought about the stories that had reached them about the new commander. Bold Halsey, they called him. A man who did not like to lose. Ruiz allowed himself a small, tired smile. It was something to hold on to. On the carrier, the strike group found their targets. Japanese carriers were steaming below, their decks crowded with aircraft preparing for their own missions against the American task force. Graves pushed his plane into a steep dive, the wind screaming past the cockpit. He released his bomb and pulled out hard, feeling the G-forces press him into the seat. Below him black smoke began to rise from one of the enemy flight decks. Other planes from his squadron were already making their runs. The sky filled with anti-aircraft fire and the twisting shapes of Japanese fighters. Graves banked hard to avoid a burst of tracers and felt his plane shudder as something struck the wing. He glanced down and saw a ragged hole in the fabric. The controls still responded. He turned for home, nursing the damaged aircraft through the clouds while other American planes continued the attack. Back on the carrier, the deck crews worked without pause. Planes that returned damaged were pushed to the side so others could land. Damage control teams moved through the ship, checking for leaks and fires after the first Japanese counterstrikes arrived. A young sailor named Seaman First Class Miller stood at his damage control station in a compartment below the hangar deck. He had been on the ship for only a few months, but he had already learned that the difference between living and dying often came down to how fast a man could move when the alarm sounded. When the first bomb struck nearby, the compartment shook and the lights flickered. Miller grabbed his tools and followed the chief to the damaged section. Water was pouring in through a ruptured pipe. They worked in the dim emergency lighting, passing tools, and shouting instructions over the noise of the battle above. When another explosion rocked the ship, Miller was thrown against the bulkhead. He got up, wiped blood from a cut on his forehead, and kept working. The chief glanced at him once and nodded. "Good man. Keep at it." The battle raged through the day. American carriers launched strike after strike while Japanese aircraft swarmed in from their own decks. On one American carrier, the flight deck became a scene of controlled chaos. Planes landed with battle damage, some trailing smoke. Wounded men were carried below while others took their places. A pilot who had just returned from a strike against a Japanese carrier climbed out of his cockpit and immediately began helping the deck crew push his damaged plane clear. His hands were shaking from the flight, but he kept moving. When a Japanese dive bomber broke through the fighter cover and dropped its bomb close aboard, the ship heeled violently. Men on the deck were thrown off their feet. The pilot who had just landed grabbed a wounded deckhand and dragged him toward cover. They reached the side of the island structure as another explosion sent fragments screaming past them. The pilot stayed with the wounded man until corpsmen arrived, then returned to the flight deck without a word. On Guadalcanal, the Marines felt the distant thunder of the carrier battle through the ground. They could not see the ships, but they knew what was happening. Every Japanese plane that failed to appear over the airfield that day was one less bomb falling on their positions. Ruiz stood in his foxhole and watched the formation of American fighters climb away from the strip. The planes were heading north, toward the sound of the distant fighting. He thought about the men in those cockpits and wondered if any of them knew how much their actions meant to the soldiers on the ground. A sergeant nearby offered him a cigarette. They smoked in silence for a moment. "Halsey's got them going after the Jap carriers," the sergeant said. "About time somebody did." Ruiz nodded. For the first time in weeks, the pressure on the island felt like it might be easing, if only for a day. The Japanese counterattacks on the American carriers were fierce and determined. On one ship, a bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded below, starting fires that threatened the hangar. Damage control parties fought the flames while the ship continued to launch and recover aircraft. Miller stayed at his station in the flooding compartment, passing sandbags and helping shore up bulkheads even as the water rose around his legs. The chief was hit by a falling piece of debris and went down hard. Miller dragged him to safety and took over directing the work until another team arrived. When the fires were finally brought under control, the ship was still afloat and still fighting. Miller sat on a coil of rope on the deck afterward, his hands raw and his face streaked with soot. A corpsman checked the cut on his forehead and told him to get some rest. Miller shook his head. "There's still work to do," he said. He got up and went back to his station. As the day wore on, the battle began to turn against the Americans in terms of ships lost, but the Japanese carriers had been hit hard enough that their ability to support the ground offensive on Guadalcanal was crippled for the moment. American pilots had struck telling blows against the enemy flight decks. The Japanese had paid a high price in aircraft and experienced aircrews. On the American side, one carrier was lost and others were damaged, but the task force remained in the fight. Halsey's aggressive orders had forced the Japanese to react rather than dictate the pace of the campaign. The men on Guadalcanal felt the difference. The air raids over the island slackened. Supplies that had been threatened by Japanese naval activity began to reach the beaches again. The exhausted Marines who had been bracing for another major ground assault found themselves with a brief breathing space. Graves brought his damaged plane back to the carrier and landed hard. The wing with the hole in it had been giving him trouble the entire flight home. Deck crews swarmed around the aircraft as soon as it stopped. Graves climbed out and walked across the deck toward the ready room. His legs felt unsteady after hours in the air. In the passageway he passed Miller, who was still moving between damage control stations even though his shift should have ended. The two men did not know each other's names, but they exchanged a brief nod. Both had done what was asked of them that day. Both had seen friends not make it back. The nod was enough. On Guadalcanal, Ruiz received word that a supply ship had made it through during the night. The men in his company would eat something other than captured Japanese rice for the first time in days. He sat with the sergeant and a few others and shared a can of meat that had somehow survived the journey. They ate slowly, savoring every bite. The conversation turned to the new admiral again. "He doesn't wait for the other guy to hit first," the sergeant said. "That's something." Ruiz thought about the pilot he had watched taking off earlier. He wondered if that man was still alive. He hoped so. The island needed every plane and every ship that could still fight. The Battle of Santa Cruz had been costly for both sides, but it had achieved something important for the Americans. Halsey's aggressive leadership had shifted the psychological balance. The Japanese had been forced to commit their carriers to protect their ground forces on Guadalcanal, and those carriers had been hurt badly enough that they could not immediately support another major push. The men on the island felt the relief immediately. The constant pressure of air raids eased. The threat of naval bombardment lessened. For the first time in weeks, the Marines holding the perimeter around Henderson Field could look at the sky and see American planes returning instead of only Japanese ones coming in. Graves sat in the ready room after the mission and wrote a short letter to his wife. He kept it simple. He told her he was safe and that the squadron had done good work. He did not describe the hole in his wing or the friends who had not returned. He folded the letter and put it in his pocket to be mailed when the chance came. Then he went back to the flight deck to help with the planes that were still landing. The ship was still at general quarters. The fight was not over. But something had changed. The men around him moved with a new purpose. Halsey's orders had given them permission to take the fight to the enemy instead of only reacting to Japanese moves. That permission mattered more than any single bomb or bullet. These sailors and pilots who fought through the long day at Santa Cruz carried more than the weight of their ships and their aircraft. They carried the hopes of the men still clinging to the mud of Guadalcanal. Their courage under fire, their willingness to launch strike after strike even when their own decks were burning, and the quiet determination of men like Miller who kept damage control parties working while the world exploded around them, deserve to be remembered and honored. If their story has moved you the way it moves me, then I think you will find real value in experiencing another powerful chapter of that same courage brought to life on screen. The film Midway, streaming now on Prime Video, captures the heart-stopping decisions and bravery of men fighting across these same waters in an earlier but equally desperate carrier battle. Or if you prefer something you can hold on to, there are excellent Pacific War books and commemorative memorabilia that let you connect more deeply with the sacrifices made in this theater. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. By the time the last American plane had landed and the damaged carriers had turned south to lick their wounds, the campaign for Guadalcanal had entered a new phase. Halsey's aggressive leadership had not won the war in a single day, but it had changed the terms of the fight. The Japanese could no longer assume they held the initiative at sea. The Marines on the island could no longer assume they were fighting alone. The men who had flown the strikes and fought the fires and kept the guns firing had given the ground troops something more valuable than supplies. They had given them hope that the long, grinding defense might finally be turning into something else. The island was still far from secure. The Japanese were still far from defeated. But for the first time since the campaign began, the Americans were no longer simply reacting. They were hitting back. And the men on both the ships and the beaches could feel the difference in their bones. In the black waters of Iron Bottom Sound, on the bridge of a cruiser cutting through the darkness, a young officer named Lieutenant Commander Ellis stared at the glowing radar screen and felt his stomach tighten. The contacts were not supposed to be there. Not in these numbers. Not this close. The sea around the American task force had been quiet for hours, but now the screen showed multiple shapes moving toward them at high speed. Ellis had been on watch since midnight. His eyes burned from staring at the green glow. He called the information to the captain in a voice that stayed steady even though his heart was hammering. The captain listened, nodded once, and gave the order to go to general quarters. Throughout the ship, men who had been trying to snatch a few hours of sleep rolled out of their bunks and moved to their stations without complaint. They had learned what it meant when the alarms sounded in these waters. The sailors on the American ships knew they were heading into a fight that would be decided in minutes rather than hours. The Japanese force approaching from the north carried heavy guns meant for the airfield on Guadalcanal. If those ships reached their firing positions, the Marines holding the perimeter around Henderson Field would face a bombardment unlike anything they had endured. The men on the American cruisers and destroyers understood the stakes without needing maps or briefings. They had seen what Japanese shells could do to positions on the island. They had pulled survivors from the water after earlier battles and heard the stories. Tonight they were the only thing standing between the Japanese guns and the thin line of Marines clinging to the mud and coral. On one of the American destroyers, a young seaman named Miller stood at his battle station on the forward gun mount. He had joined the Navy straight from a small town in the Midwest and had never imagined he would find himself in waters with a name like Iron Bottom Sound. The name had been earned the hard way. Miller checked the ready ammunition one more time and tried not to think about how many ships had already gone down in these same waters. His hands were steady. He had learned to keep them that way. When the first radar contacts were confirmed as enemy, he felt a strange calm settle over him. The waiting was over. Now there was only the work. The Japanese force came on fast, unaware at first that they had been detected. The American ships maneuvered in the darkness, using what little radar advantage they possessed to close the range. On the bridge of the lead cruiser, the captain gave quiet orders. The ship heeled as it turned to bring its broadside to bear. Ellis stayed at the radar, calling ranges and bearings. His voice remained calm even as the distance closed to point-blank range. When the first American guns opened fire, the night exploded into light and noise. Tracers arced across the water. Shells screamed overhead. On the Japanese ships, men who had been preparing for an easy bombardment of the island suddenly found themselves under fire from an enemy they had not expected to meet in the dark. The battle that followed was unlike anything the sailors on either side had trained for. Ships fought at ranges so close that gun crews could see the faces of the enemy across the water. On one American cruiser, a shell from a Japanese battleship struck the bridge. The explosion killed the captain instantly and threw Ellis against the bulkhead. He came to with blood in his eyes and the sound of the gun still firing. The ship was still in the fight. He pulled himself up and staggered to the radar. The screen was still working. He began calling information again, his voice hoarse but steady. Around him, men who had seen their captain die kept their stations. One young signalman took over passing orders. Another helped a wounded officer to the deck. The ship continued to fire. Miller's destroyer was in the thick of it. Japanese shells were falling around them, sending up great columns of water that drenched the gun crews. Miller stayed at his mount, loading and firing as fast as the gun would allow. When a shell fragment struck the man next to him, Miller pulled the wounded sailor behind the gun shield and kept working. He did not have time to think about what he was doing. There was only the next shell, the next target, the next order shouted through the smoke. The destroyer weaved between larger ships, firing torpedoes when the opportunity came and then turning to bring its guns back into action. Miller felt the deck jump beneath his feet each time the forward guns fired. He tasted cordite and salt spray and smoke. He kept loading. On one of the Japanese cruisers, a young officer stood on the bridge and watched the American ships appear out of the darkness like ghosts. The surprise was complete. His ship had been preparing to bombard the airfield when the first American shells arrived. Now the night was filled with the flash of gunfire and the roar of exploding ammunition. The officer gave orders to return fire, but the range was so close that the guns could barely depress far enough. He felt the ship shudder as American shells struck home. Around him, men were dying. He stayed at his post because there was nowhere else to go. When a shell exploded on the bridge, he was thrown to the deck. He crawled to the voice tube and kept giving orders until the ship began to list heavily. Only then did he allow himself to be helped toward the lifeboats. The American ships were taking terrible punishment. On Ellis's cruiser, fires were burning below decks. Damage control parties fought them in the dark while the guns above continued to fire. One compartment was flooding fast. Men worked waist-deep in water, passing sandbags and shoring up bulkheads. A young damage control man named Rivera stayed at his post even after he was burned by steam from a ruptured pipe. He kept working until the flooding was brought under control, then collapsed from exhaustion and pain. His shipmates carried him to the aid station. The ship kept fighting. As the melee reached its height, ships on both sides were burning and sinking. The water was filled with oil and debris and men struggling to stay alive. On one American destroyer that had been hit hard, the captain made the decision to ram a Japanese ship rather than let his vessel be sunk without striking back. The two ships collided in a grinding crash of steel. Men on both vessels were thrown from their feet. The American destroyer began to sink almost immediately. The captain stayed on the bridge until the last possible moment, giving orders to abandon ship. When the water reached the bridge, he stepped into the sea with his men. Miller's destroyer survived the worst of the fighting but was badly damaged. He helped carry wounded shipmates to the boats when the order to abandon ship finally came. The sea was cold and full of oil. Miller swam away from the burning wreck, pulling a wounded man with him. Around them, other survivors were doing the same. Some called for help. Others simply floated in silence, staring at the burning ships. Miller kept swimming until he reached a raft. He pulled the wounded man aboard and then climbed in himself. They drifted in the darkness while the battle continued around them. Miller thought about his family back home and wondered if they would ever know what had happened here. He did not have the strength to write a letter in his mind. He simply held onto the raft and waited for whatever came next. On Ellis's cruiser, the fighting finally began to slacken as the Japanese force turned away. The ship was still afloat but barely. Fires burned in several compartments. The dead and wounded lay where they had fallen. Ellis stayed at the radar until the last contact faded from the screen. Then he allowed himself to sit down on the deck. His hands were shaking. He had not realized how tightly he had been gripping the edge of the console. A corpsman checked him for injuries and found none serious. Ellis nodded his thanks and went back to work helping move the wounded. The ship was still his responsibility until someone told him otherwise. As dawn broke over Iron Bottom Sound, the coast of the night became clear. Burning ships dotted the water. Survivors clung to wreckage or floated in life rafts. On the American ships that had survived, men moved through the wreckage of their vessels, counting their dead and tending their wounded. Ellis stood on the deck of his cruiser and looked out over the sound. The Japanese force had been turned back. They had not reached the waters off Guadalcanal to bombard the airfield. The Marines on the island had been spared that horror for at least one more night. But the cost had been terrible. Too many ships lost. Too many men gone. Miller was picked up by a destroyer that had come looking for survivors. He sat on the deck wrapped in a blanket, staring at the water. The wounded man he had pulled onto the raft had not made it. Miller had held him until the end. Now he sat in silence, trying to make sense of what he had lived through. Around him other survivors were doing the same. Some spoke in low voices about what they had seen. Others simply stared at nothing. A chief petty officer brought Miller a cup of coffee. He took it without speaking. The chief sat down beside him for a moment. "You did what you could," he said. Miller nodded. It was all he had left. On Guadalcanal, the Marines who had been listening to the distant thunder through the night began to understand what had happened when they saw the smoke rising from the sound at first light. Word spread through the positions that the Navy had met the Japanese in the dark and turned them back. The airfield was safe for now. Supplies could continue to come in. The pressure on the perimeter had eased, if only for a little while. Ruiz stood in his foxhole and watched the smoke on the horizon. He thought about the sailors who had fought through the night so that he and his comrades could see another dawn. He did not know their names. He would never know most of their stories. But he knew what they had done for him. The men who fought in the first naval battle of Guadalcanal faced a level of chaos and brutality that few could have imagined. Ships fought at point-blank range in the dark. Men died at their posts or in the water while their ships burned around them. Yet in the middle of that inferno, ordinary sailors performed acts of courage and kindness that turned a potential disaster into a stand that saved the airfield and the Marines who held it. Their stories of quiet resilience, of staying at their guns when everything around them was falling apart, and of helping shipmates even when they themselves were wounded, deserve to be remembered in their full, unfiltered truth. These sailors endured hours of close-quarters combat that tested every limit of human endurance. The raw reality of what they faced, the darkness, the burning ships, the men in the water, the choices between duty and survival, lives on in photographs and footage that most platforms will never show because the images are simply too stark and too personal. If the courage of these men has stayed with you, then I want to share something that lets you see the unfiltered truth of what they endured. There is a special digital collection available that gathers rare, uncensored photographs and historical footage from the Guadalcanal campaign, material that captures the harsh realities of naval combat in ways no ordinary documentary can. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. By the time the sun was fully up on that terrible morning, the waters of Iron Bottom Sound had claimed more ships and more lives. But the Japanese force that had been meant to bombard Henderson Field had been turned back. The airfield still stood. The Marines on the island still held their positions. And the sailors who had fought through the night had proven, once again, that even in the darkest hours and the most chaotic battles, ordinary men could find the strength to do extraordinary things. The campaign for Guadalcanal was far from over. The cost would only grow higher in the days to come. But on this narrow stretch of water, in the black hours before dawn, the line had held. And that was enough to carry the fight forward into whatever came next. On a Japanese destroyer slicing through the dark waters toward Guadalcanal, a young sailor named Sato stood at his station on the deck and felt the familiar knot of fear in his stomach that came with every run of the Tokyo Express. The sea was calm, but the air carried the weight of too many nights like this one. Sato had been on these missions before. He knew the routine, the quick dash and under cover of darkness, the unloading of supplies at the beaches, the even quicker withdrawal before American planes or ships could appear. Tonight felt different. The men around him moved with a quiet tension that had not been there in the early weeks. They had heard the stories from other ships. Too many had not come back. Sato kept his hands busy checking the lines and equipment, because stopping to think too long made the fear harder to push down. The Tokyo Express had once been a lifeline. Japanese destroyers would race down from Rabaul or the Shortland Islands, loaded with food, ammunition, and sometimes fresh troops. They would reach the beaches under darkness, unload what they could, and be gone before dawn. For the soldiers waiting on Guadalcanal, those supplies had meant the difference between holding on and starving. Sato had seen the faces of the men on the beaches during the quick handovers. They were thin, their eyes hollow from malaria and hunger. They took what was given without complaint and disappeared back into the jungle. Sato had tried not to look too closely at them. He had his own job to do. On the American side, the men patrolling the waters around Guadalcanal had learned hard lessons from the earlier battles. They had lost ships and friends at Savo, at Cape Esperance, and in the terrible night of November 13th. But they had also learned. Radar was being used more effectively now. Coordination between ships had improved. PT boats prowled the approaches at night, looking for the telltale wakes of the Japanese destroyers. On one of those boats, a young lieutenant named Graves stood on the bridge and watched the dark water ahead. His boat had been out every night for weeks. They had sunk a few Japanese barges and damaged a destroyer or two, but the express kept coming. Graves knew that as long as those supply runs continued, the Japanese army on the island would keep fighting. Tonight his orders were simple: find them, hit them hard, and get out before the bigger guns arrived. Sato's destroyer reached the drop point off Tassafaronga just before midnight. The unloading began immediately. Men worked quickly in the darkness, passing crates and bags down to waiting barges. Sato helped with the lines, his hands moving automatically while his eyes scanned the horizon. The sea looked empty, but he had learned not to trust appearances. Somewhere out there, American ships or boats were hunting. He thought about the soldiers on the beach who would receive these supplies. He wondered how many of them would still be alive in a week. The thought made him work faster. The sooner they finished, the sooner they could turn for home. The first American PT boats appeared out of the darkness like sharks. Their engines were quiet at first, but then the roar came as they accelerated toward the Japanese ships. Torpedoes streaked through the water. On Sato's destroyer, the alarm sounded. Men ran to their battle stations. Sato stayed at his post on the deck, helping to cast off the barges so the ship could maneuver. A torpedo struck a nearby destroyer. The explosion lit up the night in a flash of orange and white. Sato felt the shock wave roll across the water. He kept working. Around him, other men were doing the same, loading guns, preparing depth charges, shouting orders through the chaos. The American PT boats pressed their attack. Graves' boat closed in on a Japanese destroyer that was trying to turn away. He gave the order to fire torpedoes and then swung the boat hard to avoid return fire. The torpedoes ran true. One struck the Japanese ship amidships. The explosion was deafening even at a distance. Flames shot up from the deck. Men on the stricken ship were thrown into the water. Graves felt a moment of grim satisfaction, but it did not last. Another Japanese destroyer was already firing back. Shells splashed around his boat. He ordered evasive maneuvers and prepared for another run. His crew moved with the quick efficiency that came from too many nights like this one. They were tired, but they kept going because stopping meant the Japanese supplies would keep flowing. On Sato's destroyer, the captain decided to fight rather than run. The ship turned toward the American boats and opened fire with its guns. Sato helped serve one of the smaller weapons, passing ammunition and calling out targets. The night was filled with the crack of gunfire and the roar of exploding shells. A shell from a Japanese gun struck one of the PT boats. The small vessel erupted in flames. Sato watched it burn for a moment before turning back to his work. He did not feel triumph. He felt only the cold necessity of survival. Around him, his shipmates were doing the same, firing, loading, shouting encouragement to one another when the fear threatened to show on their faces. The battle at Tassafaronga was short but brutal. The Japanese destroyers used their speed and their long-range torpedoes with deadly effect. Several American ships were hit hard. One cruiser took multiple torpedo strikes and began to sink. Men on the burning vessel fought to save their shipmates even as the decks tilted beneath them. On one of the American destroyers, a young damage control officer stayed below decks directing the fight against flooding while shells exploded above. He kept his voice calm on the speaking tubes, giving orders and encouragement to the men working in the dark compartments. When the water reached his knees, he still did not leave his post. Only when the captain ordered abandonment did he climb to the deck and help lower the boats. Sato's destroyer survived the initial attack but was damaged. The captain ordered a withdrawal. They had managed to unload some supplies, but not enough. The barges had been scattered or destroyed. As the ship turned north, Sato looked back at the burning wrecks in the water. He thought about the men who had been left behind on the beaches, the soldiers who would now have even less to eat. He thought about his own family back home and wondered if any of them would ever know what these nights had cost. The ship limped away into the darkness. Behind them, the American boats continued to hunt the remaining Japanese vessels. On Guadalcanal, the Japanese soldiers waiting for supplies felt the change immediately. The runs had been growing more dangerous for weeks. Now they were becoming impossible. Food was already short. Men were surviving on half rations or less. Malaria and dysentery were rampant. A young Japanese soldier named Private Kenji Sato, no relation to the sailor on the destroyer, sat in a shallow hole near the front lines and tried to ignore the gnawing hunger in his stomach. He had not eaten a full meal in days. His uniform hung loose on his frame. Around him, other soldiers were in the same condition. They spoke little. There was nothing left to say. Kenji thought about the letters he had written in his mind during the long nights. He had stopped composing them weeks ago. There was no point in promising things he could no longer deliver. The American patrols continued. PT boats and destroyers hunted the approaches every night. The Japanese tried a few more runs, but each one cost them more ships and more men. The supplies that did reach the island were never enough. The Tokyo Express was running out of steam. On the American side, the men who had spent so many nights hunting those destroyers began to feel a cautious optimism. They could see the effect on the ground. Japanese attacks on the perimeter were growing weaker. The enemy was no longer pushing with the same ferocity. Graves' boat continued its patrols. One night they found a Japanese barge trying to slip through. They sank it with gunfire and depth charges. As they turned for home, Graves allowed himself a small moment of satisfaction. The island was still a long way from secure, but the pressure was shifting. On Sato's damaged destroyer, the crew worked to make repairs while the ship limped north. The mood was quiet. Men who had survived the night spoke in low voices about the friends they had lost. Sato helped with the work on deck, his hands moving automatically. He thought about the soldiers on Guadalcanal who would now have even less food. He wondered how long they could hold out. He wondered how long any of them could hold out. The captain came on deck at one point and spoke quietly with the men. He did not offer false hope. He simply thanked them for their work and told them to rest when they could. Sato nodded and went back to his tasks. There was nothing else to do. The breaking of the Tokyo Express marked a turning point in the campaign, though no one on either side could see the full shape of it yet. For the Japanese on Guadalcanal, the failure of the supply runs meant the beginning of true starvation. Men who had already been weakened by weeks of fighting and disease now faced the slow, grinding reality of having almost nothing to eat. Some units began to resort to eating roots and leaves. Others spoke in whispers about worse things. The officers tried to maintain discipline, but even they could see the writing on the wall. The army on the island was being abandoned to its fate. The high command in Rabaul and Tokyo had other priorities now. Guadalcanal was becoming a place to be endured rather than won. For the Americans, the success against the Tokyo Express brought a different kind of change. The constant threat of Japanese reinforcements and bombardments had eased. The Marines on the ground could focus more on holding and strengthening their positions rather than simply surviving day to day. Supplies were still tight, but they were arriving more regularly. The men who had fought through the long nights on the water and the long days on the island began to feel, for the first time, that the tide might actually be turning. It was not victory yet. It was simply the absence of immediate defeat. That absence was enough to give them hope. Sato's destroyer eventually reached safer waters. The crew was given a few days of rest before being sent out again. Sato sat on the deck one evening and looked at the sea. He thought about the young soldier on the beach who had taken the last crate of supplies from his hands weeks earlier. He wondered if that man was still alive. He hoped so. He also hoped the war would end soon, though he did not say it out loud. Around him, other sailors were doing the same quiet thinking. They had survived another run. They had lost friends. They had delivered what they could. It was not enough. They all knew it. These men on both sides, the Japanese sailors who risked everything on dangerous night runs and the American sailors who hunted them through the dark, carried the weight of a campaign that was slowly grinding both sides down. Their courage in the face of exhaustion and loss, their small acts of kindness toward one another even when the larger war offered no mercy, and the quiet despair that came when they realized their efforts might no longer be enough, deserve to be remembered with the same care that went into living them. If these stories of ordinary men pushed to their limits have stayed with you the way they stay with me, then I would be grateful if you would consider leaving a small tip, as little as $1, on Ko-Fi. Every bit helps support the research, the writing, and the dedication it takes to bring these forgotten human stories of courage and sacrifice to light for the generations who will come after us. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. By the time the last effective Tokyo Express run had been turned back or sunk, the Japanese army on Guadalcanal was already beginning to starve. The Americans on the island and in the waters around it were beginning to believe they could win. Neither side knew yet how much more suffering lay ahead. The island had not finished with them. But the breaking of the supply line had changed the terms of the fight. From now on, every day that passed without fresh Japanese troops or supplies was a day that favored the Americans. The men who had fought in those dark waters had not ended the campaign. They had simply made the end possible. And that was enough to carry them forward into the harder days still to come. Deep in the jungle west of the American lines, a Japanese soldier named Private Kenji Sato sat with his back against a tree and tried to ignore the gnawing emptiness in his stomach that had become his constant companion. The rain had stopped for a while, but the air was still thick with moisture that clung to his skin and uniform. Around him, other men from his unit lay or sat in small groups, their eyes half closed from exhaustion and fever. Kenji had not eaten anything substantial in days. The last real meal had been a handful of rice shared among 4 men, and even that had been days ago. Now they survived on whatever they could find, roots pulled from the mud, leaves that tasted bitter and made their stomachs cramp, and occasionally a small bird or lizard caught by hand. It was never enough. Kenji had stopped writing letters in his mind weeks earlier. There was nothing left to say that would not worry his family back home. He thought of his mother sometimes, standing in the doorway of their small house, waiting for news that never came. He thought of his younger sister playing in the yard. Those thoughts used to give him strength. Now they only made the hunger sharper. He kept them at bay by focusing on small tasks, checking his rifle even though he had almost no ammunition left, helping a weaker comrade sit up when the fever made him delirious, or simply staying awake through another night of rain and insect bites. These small acts were all that remained of the soldier he had once been. The supply runs that had once brought food and medicine had stopped. The men had been told at first that more would come soon, that the high command was aware of their situation and would not abandon them. But as the weeks passed with nothing but occasional small drops by parachute or barge, most of which never reached them, the truth became impossible to ignore. They were on their own. The Tokyo Express that had once raced through these waters at night had been broken. American ships and planes now controlled the approaches. Every attempt to bring food or ammunition ended in loss. Kenji had seen the wreckage of one such attempt himself, a burned-out barge on the beach, its cargo scattered and spoiled by salt water. He and a few others had risked the American patrols to salvage what they could. There had been almost nothing usable. On the American side, the contrast was becoming visible even to the Japanese soldiers watching from a distance. Supplies were reaching the Marines regularly now. Hot food appeared in the American lines. Medical teams moved wounded men to safer positions or even evacuated some by air or sea. Kenji had watched through field glasses one afternoon as American soldiers unloaded crates from a boat that had come in under cover of their own fighters. The sight had filled him with a mixture of anger and something closer to despair. His own commanders had promised victory through spirit and determination. The Americans seemed to be winning through something simpler and more ruthless: food, medicine, and the ability to keep their men strong enough to fight. Kenji's unit had been ordered to hold a sector of the line west of the airfield. They dug shallow positions in the mud and waited. There was little fighting now. Both sides seemed to understand that the real battle had shifted from bullets to endurance. Kenji's company had started with nearly 100 men. Now fewer than 40 remained, and many of those were too weak to stand for long. Malaria had taken the strongest first, then dysentery and beriberi. Kenji himself had begun to feel the telltale swelling in his legs and the numbness in his hands that came with vitamin deficiency. He tried to hide it from the others. He still tried to help when someone collapsed. One evening he carried a feverish soldier on his back for nearly an hour through the jungle to a makeshift aid station that had almost no medicine left. The effort left him shaking and unable to eat even the small portion of roots the others had saved for him. He did it anyway because the alternative, leaving a comrade to die alone, felt worse than the hunger. At night the jungle seemed to close in. The men lay close together for warmth, though there was little warmth to share. They spoke in whispers when they spoke at all. One soldier, an older sergeant who had fought in China, sometimes told quiet stories about his village and the fields he had left behind. The others listened without interrupting. The stories were ordinary: planting rice, a festival, a child's first steps, but they became lifelines in the darkness. Kenji found himself looking forward to those moments more than he looked forward to finding food. They reminded him that there had once been a world outside this green hell where men did not measure their lives in handfuls of leaves and hours until the next fever spike. The officers tried to maintain discipline. They held roll calls when they could and issued orders about conserving ammunition and staying in position. But the orders grew harder to obey as strength faded. One lieutenant, a young man who had arrived with the last reinforcements months earlier, began to change. He had started the campaign full of confidence in the Empire's destiny. Now he spent long hours staring at maps that no longer matched the reality on the ground. He still gave orders, but his voice had lost its edge. Kenji saw him one afternoon sharing his own tiny portion of foraged food with a private who could no longer stand. The lieutenant did not make a show of it. He simply handed over the leaves and roots and then turned away as if nothing had happened. Small kindnesses like that had become the only currency that still held value. As the days blurred together, the men began to lose track of time. They measured weeks by the number of comrades who had died or become too weak to move. Kenji found himself thinking more about death than he had ever allowed himself before. He had seen men die from wounds in earlier fighting. That had been terrible, but it had been quick. This was different. This was watching friends waste away one day at a time, their bodies betraying them while their minds remained sharp enough to understand what was happening. He had helped bury 3 men in 1 week. The graves were shallow because no one had the strength to dig deeper. They marked them with sticks and whatever personal items the dead had left behind: a photograph, a small notebook, a piece of cloth. Then they returned to their positions and waited for whatever came next. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to grow stronger with each passing week. Kenji could hear their artillery more clearly now, and the sound of their aircraft overhead had become constant. Occasionally he saw American patrols moving through areas that had once been Japanese territory. The patrols moved with confidence, stopping to rest and eat in the open. Kenji and his remaining comrades watched from hiding, too weak to attack and too proud to surrender. One afternoon an American soldier came close enough that Kenji could see his face clearly. The man looked well-fed and rested. He carried a full pack and moved without the shuffling gait that had become normal among the Japanese. Kenji felt a surge of something close to envy, followed immediately by shame. He turned away and focused on staying still until the patrol passed. In the quiet moments between the rain and the fever, Kenji sometimes allowed himself to imagine what might happen if the High Command had simply decided they were no longer worth saving. The thought was too large to hold for long. He pushed it away by focusing on the next small task, helping a comrade drink from a canteen that held more mud than water, or checking the perimeter even though there was almost no one left to guard it. These acts kept him moving when his body wanted only to lie down and stop. He had seen what happened to men who stopped. They did not get back up. The Japanese High Command had made a strategic decision to cut its losses on Guadalcanal. The cost of continuing to supply the island had become too high. Ships and planes that might have been used elsewhere were being lost in the attempt to keep the 17th Army alive. From Tokyo and Rabaul, the soldiers on the island had become a problem to be managed rather than a force to be supported. The men themselves were never told this directly. They were left to discover it through empty hands and empty stomachs. The realization came slowly, like the fever that crept through their bodies. One day they simply understood that no more help was coming. The Empire had moved on. Kenji sat with two other survivors one evening as the light faded. They had found a small patch of edible roots and shared them in silence. The portions were so small they barely counted as food, but the act of dividing them equally still mattered. One of the men, a quiet private who had once been a teacher, spoke softly about his students back home. He described a lesson he had given on the importance of perseverance. The irony was not lost on any of them. They smiled anyway, thin and tired smiles that held more sadness than humor. When the private finished speaking, they sat together a little longer before returning to their positions. The small moment of connection had been worth more than the roots. The suffering on Guadalcanal was not only physical. It was the slow erosion of hope and the knowledge that their commanders had chosen to let them fade rather than risk more resources on a lost cause. The men who had once believed they were part of an unstoppable advance now faced the reality that they had been left behind. Some found strength in that realization. They decided they would endure as long as possible, not for victory, but for the simple dignity of not giving up. Others broke quietly, retreating into silence or fever dreams. Kenji moved between both states. There were days when he felt he could keep going forever if he just took one more step. There were nights when he lay awake wondering if it would be easier to simply stop fighting the hunger and the fever. The Americans continued to improve their positions. Medical supplies reached the front lines. Hot meals became more common. Letters from home arrived with greater regularity. The Marines who had once fought for every yard of ground now had the luxury of rotating units back for rest. Kenji watched these changes from a distance and understood that the war on this island had already been decided, even if the final shots had not yet been fired. His side had lost the ability to sustain itself. The other side had not. These soldiers of the 17th Army, abandoned by their own command and left to waste away in the jungle they had once been ordered to conquer, showed a quiet endurance that went beyond orders or training. Their small acts of kindness toward one another, sharing the last scrap of food, carrying a weaker man when they could barely walk themselves, speaking of home in the darkness, were the only light left in a world that had grown very dark. Their story of suffering and resilience deserves to be remembered in its full, unfiltered depth. If these accounts of ordinary men facing the slow agony of abandonment have stayed with you, then I invite you to join our Patreon community. There you can access exclusive and censored video sections, bonus podcast episodes with deeper historical analysis, raw stories that go further than we can share here, and connect directly with a passionate group of fellow history enthusiasts who want to explore the Pacific War with this same honesty and detail. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. By the time the last organized resistance had faded into isolated groups of starving men, the Japanese 17th Army no longer existed as a fighting force. It had become something else, a collection of individuals trying to survive one more day in a place that had taken everything from them. The Americans on the other side of the lines were growing stronger with each passing week. The contrast was stark and final. One army had been fed and supported. The other had been left to wither. The men who had lived through that withering would carry the memory of it for the rest of their lives. Some would never speak of it. Others would try, in quiet moments, to explain what it had felt like to be abandoned by the very empire they had been willing to die for. The island had not finished with them yet. But the worst of the suffering, the slow realization that no one was coming, had already done its work. The shadows had claimed what the guns could not. In a makeshift camp deep in the jungle, a Japanese soldier named Private Kenji Sato listened in stunned silence as his officer explained that they were leaving the island. The words did not make sense at first. They had been told for months that victory was still possible, that reinforcements would come, that the Empire would not abandon them. Now they were being ordered to slip away in the night like thieves. Kenji felt a strange mixture of relief and something darker that he could not yet name. He had dreamed of escape from this green hell so many times that the reality of it felt unreal. Around him, other survivors sat or lay in the mud, their faces too thin and too tired to show much emotion. Some nodded without speaking. Others simply closed their eyes as if the news were another fever dream. The officer did not try to dress the order in glory. He told them plainly that the High Command had decided the island could no longer be held or supplied. They were to move at night in small groups toward the western beaches. Destroyers would come under cover of darkness to take them off. There would be no grand farewell, no final battle. They were to leave quietly and leave behind anyone too weak to walk. Kenji looked at the men around him who could barely stand. He thought of the comrades already buried in shallow graves and the ones still breathing but too far gone to save. The officer's voice remained steady, but his eyes betrayed the same exhaustion that had settled over all of them. When he finished speaking, no one cheered or protested. They simply began to gather what little they still possessed. The decision to withdraw had been made far from the island, and rooms where maps and reports replaced the reality of mud and hunger. The cost of continuing had become impossible to justify. Too many ships had been lost trying to bring food and ammunition. Too many planes had been shot down. The soldiers who remained were no longer an army capable of offensive action. There were survivors clinging to a patch of jungle while their bodies failed them one by one. The order for Operation Coup was therefore not a strategic withdrawal in the usual sense. It was an admission that the campaign had been lost and that saving what could still be saved was the only remaining choice. The men who received the order were never told the full truth. They were simply told to move. Kenji helped a weaker soldier to his feet. The man's name was Hiroshi. He had once been strong enough to carry extra ammunition for the machine gun teams. Now he could barely lift his own rifle. Kenji took the weapon from him without asking and slung it over his own shoulder. Hiroshi tried to protest, but the words came out as a whisper. Kenji told him to save his strength for walking. They moved together through the darkness, following the thin line of men ahead. The jungle that had once felt like an enemy now felt almost familiar. Kenji knew every root and vine that could trip a man already weak from hunger. He kept one hand on Hiroshi's arm and guided him around the worst of the obstacles. Small kindnesses like this had become the only thing that still connected them to the soldiers they had once been. The evacuation was carried out in stages over several nights. Destroyers appeared off the western beaches at precise times, loaded what men they could, and vanished again before dawn. There was no time for ceremony. Men who could still walk were helped or carried to the water's edge. Those who could not were left with what little food and medicine remained. Some of the abandoned men accepted their fate with quiet resignation. Others called out to their departing comrades, not in anger but in simple farewell. Kenji heard one such voice as he helped Hiroshi onto a barge. He turned once and saw a soldier sitting against a tree, too weak to rise. Their eyes met for a moment. Kenji nodded. The man nodded back. There was nothing else to give. On the destroyers, the rescued men sat or lay in whatever space could be found. Many were too exhausted to speak. Kenji found a place near the rail and watched the dark shape of the island recede. He felt the relief he had expected, the simple animal relief of leaving a place that had tried to kill him every day for months. But beneath it ran a current of shame he could not shake. They were leaving behind men who had fought and suffered beside them. They were leaving without having achieved anything the High Command had promised. The Empire had sent them to take an island. Now it was taking them back because it could no longer afford to keep them there. Kenji thought of the letters he had never finished writing. He wondered what he would say if he ever reached home. He wondered if he would be able to say anything at all. The Americans on the other side of the island had no idea the withdrawal was happening. They were preparing for what they believed would be the final push to clear the remaining Japanese positions. Marines strengthened their lines and stockpiled ammunition. Patrols probed forward, expecting resistance that never came. On one such patrol, a young American lieutenant named Graves moved through the jumble with his platoon. They had been told to expect heavy fighting. Instead, they found empty positions and abandoned equipment. At first, they moved cautiously, suspecting a trap. Then they began to see the truth in the details. Cooking fires long cold. Weapons left behind. Bodies that had not been buried because no one had the strength. Graves stopped at one position and picked up a small notebook. The pages were filled with Japanese writing he could not read, but the careful handwriting and the small drawings of flowers in the margins told him this had belonged to a man who had once hoped to go home. As more patrols reported the same thing, the realization spread through the American lines. The Japanese were gone. Not defeated in a final battle, but simply gone. Graves walked into a larger camp that had clearly been occupied until very recently. Personal items lay scattered, photographs, letters, small carved figures. One letter, written in careful script, had been left open on a makeshift table. Graves could not read the words, but he could see the care that had gone into writing them. He folded the letter and placed it back where he had found it. Around him his men moved quietly, the usual banter silenced by what they were seeing. They had expected a final fight. Instead, they were walking through the remains of an army that had simply faded away. On the Japanese destroyers carrying the last evacuees north, the mood remained subdued. Men who had survived the worst of Guadalcanal now faced the strange reality of being alive when so many others were not. Some spoke of home for the first time in months. Others sat in silence, staring at nothing. Kenji stayed near Hiroshi, who had improved slightly once he was on the ship and given a little food and water. They did not talk much. There was still too much to process. One evening Kenji found a piece of paper and a pencil. He began a letter to his family. He wrote that he was safe and that he hoped to see them soon. He did not write about the island or the men left behind. Those things belonged to a different life now. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket. He would mail it when he could. The Americans who discovered the abandoned positions spent days walking through what had once been Japanese territory. They found evidence of the suffering everywhere: makeshift hospitals with no medicine, graves marked only by sticks, cooking pots that had been used to boil roots and leaves. Graves and his platoon came across one such site where several men had clearly died in their sleep. Their bodies had not been moved. Personal items were still arranged around them as if their owners had simply lain down and not woken up. One man still held a photograph of a woman and child. Graves looked at it for a long moment, then placed it gently back in the dead man's hand. He did not take it as a souvenir. Some things were not meant to be taken. The withdrawal had been a success in the narrowest military sense. Thousands of Japanese soldiers had been removed from the island before they could be completely destroyed. But the cost in human terms was visible in every abandoned position and every exhausted man who reached safety. The Empire had saved what it could, but it had done so by leaving others behind and by admitting, without ever saying the words, that Guadalcanal had been lost. The men who survived carried that knowledge with them. Some would speak of it later. Most would not. The shame of retreat and the relief of survival existed together in the same silence. Kenji stood on the deck of the destroyer as it carried him away from the island for the last time. The green shape grew smaller until it was only a dark line on the horizon. He thought of all the men who had not made it this far, the ones buried in shallow graves, the ones left in the jungle because they could not walk, the ones who had died in the fighting months earlier. He thought of Hiroshi, who was resting below deck and might yet live to see his family again. He thought of the American soldiers who were now walking through the camps they had left behind. He wondered what those men would think when they saw the evidence of how close the Japanese had come to complete collapse. He wondered if any of them would understand. These soldiers who slipped away in the night carried with them the complicated truth of what had happened on Guadalcanal. They had been ordered to take an island and had instead been slowly starved and broken. They had been told they were part of an unstoppable advance and had instead been quietly removed when that advance became impossible to sustain. Their story contains both the quiet courage of men who helped one another survive and the deeper shame of an army that was abandoned by its own command. If these accounts of ordinary soldiers facing impossible choices have stayed with you, then I think you will find real value in exploring the lesser-known operations and hidden decisions that shape moments like this one. I invite you to sign up for our free email newsletter, where you will receive the exclusive ebook The Shadow War, 5 top-secret operations that shaped World War II, along with regular deep-dive stories about espionage, forgotten heroes, and the quiet actions that changed the course of the war in ways most histories never mention. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. By the time the last Japanese destroyer had vanished into the northern darkness, Guadalcanal belonged to the Americans. The island that had once been a Japanese objective was now firmly in Allied hands. The men who had fought there on both sides would carry the memory of it for the rest of their lives. Some would speak of victory. Others would speak only of survival. The truth lay somewhere between those two things, in the mud, in the hunger, in the small kindnesses that had kept men alive when everything else had been taken from them, and in the quiet ships that carried the last survivors away while leaving so many others behind. The campaign was over. The island had decided its own ending. Years after the last ship left Guadalcanal, a man sat on his front porch in a small American town and still woke some nights reaching for a rifle that was no longer there. The dreams came without warning. One moment he was in his own bed, the next he was back in the mud with tracers cutting through the darkness and the sound of men calling for help they would never receive. He would sit up gasping, his heart hammering, until the familiar shapes of his bedroom returned. His wife had learned not to ask what he had seen. She simply placed a hand on his back until his breathing slowed. Then she would get up and make tea, and they would sit together in the quiet until the night passed. He never told her the details. Some things were meant to stay on the island. Private First Class Danny Ruiz had come home with a limp from a shrapnel wound that had never healed quite right and a collection of nightmares that no doctor could explain away. He had been one of the young Marines who landed in the early days and somehow survived the long months that followed. On the island he had learned to keep moving no matter how tired or scared he felt. At home that same instinct made it difficult to sit still. He took long walks at odd hours, unable to explain why the walls of his childhood bedroom sometimes felt like the walls of a foxhole. His parents tried to understand. They listened when he talked about the friends who had not come back and stayed silent when he could not find the words. His mother kept his letters from the war in a box on her dresser. Sometimes she would take them out and read them again, trying to find the boy who had written them before the island had changed everything. On the other side of the world, Private Kenji Sato stepped off a train in his hometown and felt like a stranger in his own skin. The evacuation from Guadalcanal had saved his life, but it had not erased what he had seen and done there. He had helped carry weaker men to the beaches during Operation Coup. He had left others behind because there was no strength left to carry them. Those faces stayed with him. When he tried to sleep, he sometimes heard their voices. His family welcomed him with quiet relief. They did not ask about the war. They saw how thin he was, how his hands sometimes shook when he held a cup of tea, and they understood that some questions would never be answered. Kenji spent long hours walking the fields where he had once played as a boy. The familiar landscape felt distant now, as if the island had taken a piece of him that could never be returned. The physical wounds were the easiest to see. Ruiz walked with a cane on bad days and carried a scar across his thigh that pulled tight when the weather changed. Kenji bore the marks of malaria that would flare up without warning for years afterward, leaving him feverish and weak. Both men had learned to live with pain that never fully left. What was harder were the wounds no one could see. Ruiz found himself unable to enjoy loud celebrations. Fireworks on the 4th of July sent him searching for cover before he could stop himself. Kenji discovered that crowded places made his chest tighten. He preferred the quiet of the fields or the company of one or two old comrades who had also survived. They did not need to explain themselves to each other. A look was often enough. Small moments of kindness helped both men find their way back to something resembling normal life. Ruiz's younger brother began joining him on his evening walks without being asked. They rarely spoke during those walks, but the simple presence of someone who did not expect him to be the same person he had been before the war made the nights easier. Kenji's sister started leaving a small plate of food by his door each morning, the same way their mother had done when he was a child. She never commented on how little he sometimes ate. She simply refilled the plate the next day. These quiet gestures did not erase the nightmares or the guilt, but they reminded both men that they were still connected to the world they had left behind. Survivors' guilt weighed on them in different ways. Ruiz kept a list in his mind of the men from his unit who had not come home. He could recite their names without effort. On anniversaries he would walk to a small memorial in his town and stand there for a while, thinking of each one. He had written letters to some of their families after the war, trying to find words that might bring comfort. The letters were never enough. He knew that. But he wrote them anyway because doing nothing felt worse. Kenji carried a different kind of guilt. He had survived when so many others had not. He had been evaluated while comrades were left in the jungle. He sometimes wondered if he deserved to be alive when better men had died. His old sergeant, the one who had told stories about his village during the worst nights on the island, had not made it off the beach. Kenji had carried that man's photograph for months after the war, until one day he placed it in a drawer and could not bring himself to look at it again. The island had changed both men in ways their families could see but not always understand. Ruiz came home quieter than he had been. He had once been quick to laugh. Now laughter came more slowly, and when it did it often carried an edge of something else. Kenji returned with a stillness that had not been there before. He could sit for hours without speaking, watching the fields or the sky. His parents worried that he would never marry or find steady work. They did not understand that the war had taken his ability to plan for a future he had once taken for granted. Both men learned to live with the version of themselves that had returned. They did not expect to become who they had been before. They simply tried to build something new from what remained. Physical recovery took time and patience. Ruiz spent months in physical therapy learning to walk without pain. The exercises were simple but exhausting. He would come home afterward and sit on the porch with his father, neither of them speaking much. The silence was comfortable. Kenji's recovery from malaria and malnutrition was slower. There were days when he could barely leave his bed. His sister would sit with him then, reading aloud from books they had shared as children. The familiar stories became anchors. On better days he would walk to the edge of the fields and stand there until his strength returned. He never spoke of what he had seen during those walks. Some memories were meant to stay private. The emotional cost extended beyond the men themselves. Ruiz's parents aged visibly during the months he was gone and continued to worry long after he returned. His mother kept his letters in that box on her dresser and sometimes read them when she thought no one was watching. His father, who had served in an earlier war, understood more than he let on. He would sit with Ruiz on the porch during the bad nights and smoke in silence until the shaking stopped. Kenji's family carried their own quiet burden. They had received almost no news during the worst months of the campaign. When he finally came home, they saw the change in him and chose not to press for explanations. Love, in those first months, often meant knowing what not to ask. Both men eventually found work and built lives, but the island never fully left them. Ruiz took a job at a local factory and married a woman who had known him before the war. She learned to recognize the signs when a nightmare was coming and would wake him gently before it could take hold. Kenji found work in the fields again, the same fields he had walked as a boy. The physical labor helped quiet his mind during the day. At night he sometimes wrote letters he never sent, trying to put into words what he could not say out loud. Neither man considered himself a hero. They had simply done what was asked of them and survived. That survival carried its own weight. The human cost of Guadalcanal extended far beyond the island itself. It reached into small towns and villages on both sides of the ocean, into families who waited for letters that stopped coming, and into the lives of men who came home changed in ways no one had prepared them for. The physical scars healed or became familiar. The deeper wounds, the ones that lived in memory and in the quiet hours before dawn, remained. They shaped how these men saw the world, how they raised their children, and how they understood courage long after the guns had fallen silent. The generation that fought on Guadalcanal carried those scars into the peace that followed, and the world they helped build was marked by both the victory they had won and the price they had paid to win it. These survivors, whether they returned to American towns or Japanese villages, carried the weight of what they had endured in ways that defined the rest of their lives. Their courage did not end when the fighting stopped. It continued in the daily choice to keep going, to build something new from what remained, and to honor the friends who had not come home by living as fully as they could. If their stories of quiet endurance and the long road back from the island have stayed with you, then I think you will find real value in experiencing another powerful chapter of that same courage brought to life on screen. The film Midway, streaming now on Prime Video, captures the heart-stopping decisions and bravery of men fighting across these same waters. Or if you prefer something you can hold on to, there are excellent Pacific War books and commemorative memorabilia that let you connect more deeply with the sacrifices made in this theater. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. By the time the last veteran had found his way home and begun the long process of living with what he had seen, the true measure of Guadalcanal was no longer found in maps or casualty lists. It was found in the quiet moments on front porches and in fields, in the letters never sent and the names never forgotten, and in the simple fact that ordinary men had been asked to endure the unendurable and had somehow found the strength to keep going. The scars remained. They always would. But so did the quiet determination to live in a way that honored what had been lost. That determination became part of the peace that followed, carried forward by men who had learned on a distant island that survival itself could be an act of courage. Years later, When a veteran was asked what Guadalcanal had truly changed, he would often fall silent for a moment before speaking, as if the answer still lived somewhere between the mud of the island and the life he had built afterward. He had been a young Marine once, one of the first to wade ashore when the future of the Pacific still hung in the balance. He had watched friends die in the dark at Itzen's Ridge and stood his ground during the long October nights when it seemed the entire Japanese army was coming straight at him. He had survived the hunger and the fever in the nights when the only thing louder than the guns was the sound of men calling for help that never arrived. When the last Japanese ships finally slipped away, he had felt something shift, not just on the island, but in the larger war itself. It took him years to understand what that shift had meant. The airfield they had fought so desperately to hold had become something far greater than a strip of coral. From that single muddy runway, American planes could now reach out and strike at Japanese positions across the Solomons. Supply lines that had once been threatened by enemy bombers were now protected. The Japanese, who had once moved freely through these waters, found themselves forced into a defensive posture they had never planned for. What had begun as a desperate American gamble to stop an enemy airfield had turned into the first solid foothold in a campaign that would eventually carry Allied forces all the way to Tokyo. The young Marine who had once measured his life in hours between raids now understood that the ground beneath his boots had helped rewrite the future of an entire ocean. On the Japanese side, the men who had been evaluated during those final nights carried a different kind of understanding. Private Kenji Sato had been one of them. He had watched the island disappear into the darkness from the deck of a destroyer and felt both relief and a deep, lasting shame. He had survived when so many others had not. He had left comrades behind because there was no strength left to carry them. In the years that followed, he would sometimes sit in the fields near his home and wonder what the war might have become if his commanders had understood sooner that an island so far from home could not be held by spirit alone. The empire that had sent him to conquer had instead been forced to abandon him and thousands like him. That realization changed how he saw his country and how he saw himself. The boy who had once believed in inevitable victory had returned as a man who understood that even the strongest nations could be broken by distance, by logistics, and by the simple refusal of ordinary men to yield. The Americans who remained on Guadalcanal after the Japanese withdrawal felt the change in more immediate ways. Supplies arrived with greater regularity. Hot meals replaced the endless diet of captured rice and emergency rations. Medical teams could finally treat the wounded without the constant threat of new attacks. The Marines who had once fought for every yard of ground now had the breathing room to strengthen their positions and prepare for what would come next. A young lieutenant named Graves, who had led patrols through the abandoned Japanese camps, wrote to his family that the island no longer felt like a trap. It felt like a base. That single word carried more hope than any speech could have offered. The men who read his letter understood that something fundamental had shifted. The war was no longer about simply surviving another day. It was about moving forward. The lessons learned on Guadalcanal shaped everything that followed. American forces discovered that holding a distant airfield could be more valuable than winning a single dramatic battle. They learned that jungle warfare demanded new kinds of endurance and new kinds of leadership. They learned that ships and planes working together could isolate an enemy army more effectively than ground troops alone. These were not abstract ideas. They were truths paid for with the lives of men who had stood their ground when everything seemed lost. The pilots who had kept Henderson Field alive through daily raids, the sailors who had fought through the black nights of Iron Bottom Sound, and the Marines who had refused to break at Itzen's Ridge had all contributed to a single, larger truth: the Pacific could be won, but only by men willing to endure what no one had prepared them to endure. For the Japanese, the loss of Guadalcanal forced a complete rethinking of their strategy. The dream of a quick victory that would force the Americans to negotiate had died in the mud and the hunger of that island. From now on, they would fight a defensive war, trying to hold a shrinking perimeter while their resources dwindled. The men who had once advanced with confidence now found themselves ordered to dig in and wait for an enemy that grew stronger with every passing month. Kenji Sato saw this change in the faces of the officers who had once spoken of destiny. They spoke now of endurance and of holding what remained. The empire that had seemed unstoppable had been forced to accept that its reach had exceeded its grasp. That acceptance came at a terrible cost in lives and in pride, but it also marked the beginning of a different kind of war, one the Japanese could not win. The human cost of that turning point lived on in the men who survived it. Ruiz came home carrying both pride in what he had helped accomplish and grief for the friends who had not lived to see the end. He would sometimes sit with other veterans and talk about the island in the careful way men speak of something that still has the power to hurt them. They spoke of the small moments that had kept them alive, the shared cigarette in the dark, the word of encouragement when strength was gone, the simple refusal to leave a wounded man behind. Those moments had not won the war by themselves, but without them the larger victory would never have been possible. The men who had lived through Guadalcanal understood that courage was not a single dramatic act. It was the daily choice to keep going when every part of you wanted to stop. Kenji Sato carried a different burden. He had survived the evacuation and returned to a country that was slowly losing the war he had once believed was already won. He rarely spoke of Guadalcanal to anyone outside his small circle of surviving comrades. When he did speak, it was often about the men who had not come home and about the strange mercy of being allowed to live when so many others had been left behind. He had learned that survival carried its own responsibilities. He tried to honor the dead by living a quiet life, by working the fields his family had tended for generations, and by remembering that even in the worst moments there had been small acts of kindness that had made the suffering bearable. Those acts had not changed the outcome of the war, but they had changed what the war had meant to him. The pivot that Guadalcanal represented was not only military. It was also deeply human. The Americans who had once feared they might lose the entire Southern Pacific now believed they could win it. Their factories produced more planes and ships than the Japanese could hope to match. Their morale, tested by early defeats, had been hardened into something stronger by the stand on that distant island. The Japanese, who had once moved from victory to victory, now faced the reality that their early successes had stretched their resources beyond the breaking point. The island that had seemed so insignificant on a map had become the place where both sides learned the true cost of fighting across vast distances with limited supplies and exhausted men. In the years that followed, veterans from both sides would look back on Guadalcanal as the moment when the war stopped being about quick triumphs and became about something slower and harder. It was the place where ordinary men discovered they could endure more than they had ever imagined and where nations discovered that victory required more than courage alone. It required the ability to keep men fed and armed and alive long enough for that courage to matter. The airfield that had once been a desperate gamble became the foundation upon which the rest of the Allied advance was built. The Japanese soldiers who had once believed they were invincible learned that even the strongest army could be worn down by distance, by disease, and by an enemy willing to pay the price of holding ground no one else wanted. These men, American and Japanese alike, carried the memory of that island into the peace that eventually came. Some spoke of it often. Others kept their silence. All of them understood that what had happened on Guadalcanal had changed more than the map of the Pacific. It had changed them. The young Marine who had once reached for a rifle in his sleep learned to live with the dreams and to build a life around the man he had become. The Japanese soldier who had once believed in destiny learned to live with the knowledge that destiny could be broken by ordinary men who simply refused to break themselves. Their stories, and the stories of all the men who stood with them through the long months of that campaign, remind us that turning points are not only marked by battles won or lost. They are marked by the quiet endurance of people who discover, in the worst possible circumstances, that they are capable of more than they ever believed possible. The raw truth of what those men endured, the jumble that never dried, the nights that never ended, the hunger that never left, and the small kindnesses that somehow kept them going. lives on in images and accounts too stark for most screens to show. If their courage and their suffering have stayed with you, then I want to share something that lets you see the unfiltered reality of what they faced. There is a special digital collection available that gathers rare, uncensored photographs and historical footage from the Guadalcanal campaign, material that captures the harsh, unfiltered truths of jungle warfare and naval combat in ways no ordinary documentary can. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. By the time the last veteran had found his way home and the island had been left to the quiet that follows war, Guadalcanal had already become something larger than itself. It had become the place where the Pacific War changed direction, where one side learned it could win and the other learned it could lose, and where ordinary men discovered that history is not only made by generals and presidents but by the daily choice to stand when standing seems impossible. The scars remained on the bodies and in the memories of those who survived. The lessons remained in the way the war was fought afterward. And the meaning of that distant, muddy island remained in the simple fact that the men who had been asked to hold it had done so long enough for the future to turn in their favor. That was the pivot. That was the gift they gave to the generations who came after them, the knowledge that even the smallest piece of ground, held by ordinary people with nothing left but their refusal to yield, can change the course of everything that follows.